Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered podcast. Today I'm joined by my co-host Colin and our special guest Greg from Jubilee. And today what we're going to be doing is Colin and I have found this amazing document that claims to be able to prove every step of Catholicism, and we're going to be showing it to Greg, who didn't grow up very religious. And Colin and I will both kind of be steel-manning the position, getting Greg's reaction, and then Colin and I's reactions as two ex-traditional Catholics who are involved in the movement. And so that's kind of the rundown of today's show. And welcome to my banger podcast, Greg.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be converted.
Yes. Are you ready?
Yeah.
By the end of this episode, you're going to be on your knees in adoration, I think is our goal.
Yes. Perfect.
So I'm going to share my screen here. And Colin, you want to explain what kind of this document claims to be proving and why we chose this document in particular?
Well, you were sent this document by someone who wanted you to give your thoughts on it. The document is trying to claim essentially, here's a step-by-step process where you can go from agnosticism to justified belief in the truth of the Catholic Church as the one true path to spiritual salvation. It purports to be able to take someone who has no knowledge of Catholicism or anything regarding religion, even you could be a fully agnostic to the idea of God, and they want to take you from that point all the way to a true believing Catholic. We will see if they can.
Yeah. In this document, my understanding, it looks like it's from a reputable institution. We're not straw manning or finding the worst possible thing out there. By no means is this expansive, it doesn't hit every argument ever, but I think it's a great example. It's emblematic of a lot of these Catholic arguments out there. Greg, are you ready to dive in?
It reminds me a lot of my middle school apologetics class. It is very...
I would say graphic design is very passionate when I made this. It's great. That's a great opening slide there. Mm-hmm. I like how the text is kind of behind the statue and they have the moody lighting.
Mm-hmm.
It is a very clean design.
Yeah. It's shining light on religion, just like the light is literally shining in the picture.
Somebody should get you your own podcast with Bach intro music and call it the Greg Experience.
Hell yeah. Today we're talking about this beautiful thing. What happens to men?
Yes. And the other thing that, and we'll dive into this document here after I finish this mini rant, is I find this whole I can prove every step of religion problematic, because as soon as you hit out one of these planks in this subsequent and building sort of proof, then the whole thing collapses.
It's like a Jenga tower.
And it's also not that... Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say also, that's not very nice to the other religions, the little kind of subtitle there. A journey to the true religion.
Well, yeah, they don't.
That's not very nice.
They believe the other religions are either misguided, foolish, or demonic inherently.
I've always noted, when I talk to people who are really, really religious, because I'm not religious at all, they will be way meaner about religion than me, but just for all the other religions.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And the other strange thing about proving religion is that what you have to do is prove every single step beyond a doubt, right? Most people who arrive to this dogmatic view of religion or claim to be Catholic, they're not well, I think if we look at the evidence, maybe Catholicism is right, but also these other religions are right. They're strict adherents. So you both have to prove every single step. And then also every single step can't have a reasonable alternative to get to dogma, this is a whole other thing on my issues with the epistemology of apologetics. But let's dive in. So for people listening at home, first page it says the Fundamental Five, a journey to the true religion with a Madonna statue.
It's the Pietà, actually.
Oh, my bad.
Mea
culpa. Colin, do you want to read this first page?
Sure.
And then we'll go right to Greg's reaction.
All right, so the Fundamental Five, a journey to the true religion. The introduction says, if the beginning is so important to the journey, most especially to a successful journey's end, then where does one begin in the search for the true religion, if indeed there is one? Put another way, what are the fundamental questions one must ask, and in what order, to arrive at certainty that the faith before him is true? Oh, pronoun confusion. Anyway, the answer to that question is what we at Think Catholic call the Fundamental Five. These are the 5 fundamental questions that, if answered in the affirmative, necessarily lead to the demonstrable veracity of the Catholic faith. Question 1. Does God exist? Question 2. Are the Gospels historically reliable? 3. Did Jesus claim to be God? 4. Did Jesus establish a church and bestow upon it the charism of infallibility? 5. Is that church the present-day Catholic Church? This booklet will walk you through these questions, offering concise but substantial reasoning for each. We invite you to approach this journey with an open heart and a searching mind, for, as Christ himself declared, quote, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." And then there's also an Aristotle quote from the Nicomachean Ethics.
And
there's a statue again.
Yeah, we got another
statues.
Western culture, Greek statue. Yeah.
And I love religious writings when they have to capitalize the weirdest things. And it's such like you're reading through and they'll capitalize like the or like faith or in this case true religion in the middle of a sentence.
It's like corporate emails. Have you ever gotten a corporate email where it's like our capital S strategy is we will bring capital S satisfaction. It's like they use capitalization as like an underline. Okay, so I think it's gonna fall apart at number 1. Does God exist?
Well,
I think I have a comment about number 2, which is the kind of like, what is the word, historicity of it? Like, because to my understanding, first of all, the Gospels, is that the same thing as the Bible, or are the Gospels like a subset of the Bible, or what are the Gospels?
The Gospels are the 4 books of the Bible that start off the New Testament, and they are essentially the story of Jesus.
Okay, so
they're like the center of Christianity.
So to my understanding, there is not a consensus among theologians about what parts of the Bible are allegorical or symbolic or literal. And so are the Gospels historically reliable is an interesting question, because I feel like they need to delineate which parts of it are claiming to be historically accurate in the first place. I think number 1 is really where this is not gonna get me.
So you're saying if 1 and 2, if they're a given, you think you could be sold on 3, 4, and 5 being the path?
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't know. My initial impression is that like it doesn't follow what it means for the Catholic faith to be true, right? And Colin and I are so far down the rabbit hole into this stuff that even if you just say like the current church is the present day Catholic Church, the question becomes like, so what do you do about it? And then you have to prove like the auspices of these like very niche historical documents on what you can and can't do. Like there are so many more steps beyond this.
Right.
Maybe to simplify it down to this is like this is infinitely complicated.
I will say it's interesting because when I was growing up, it was always 3 questions. That was how I was taught. It was
God, the gospel, and the church.
That's why you should have gotten this pamphlet, man. That's where you messed up.
Yeah. They kind of wrapped 4 and 5 into 1, and they kind of wrapped 2 and 3 into 1.
Okay.
That's kind of how it was.
Yeah.
So let's find out if God exists.
Yeah,
that's an interesting first step.
Don't get your hopes too far up on this one.
Okay.
Number 1.
You go.
Does God exist? Where did everything come from anyway? A passerby might say the Big Bang. Interestingly enough, a Catholic priest was among the...
A passerby?
A passerby.
You're just like on a park bench just talking as someone walking their dog just looks over their shoulder. The Big Bang!
Just, you yell it like a slur out the window at somebody.
Yeah, like you're just getting like catcalled. Just, the Big Bang! That's great. Okay, sorry.
Interestingly enough, a Catholic priest was among the first to propose the theory. In 1927, Father Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian Catholic priest and physicist, formulated what is now called the Big Bang Theory. His work was so compelling that Albert Einstein, after hearing him explain it, stood before a gathering of scientists and declared, quote, "This is the most beautiful and satisfactory explanation of creation to which I have ever listened," unquote. One does not need to accept the Big Bang Theory, but since many do, let's use it as a point of departure for our inquiry. A cause beyond time and space. The Big Bang asserts that all time, space, and matter came into existence at a single moment. But whatever caused time, space, and matter to come into being cannot itself be bound by them. This cause must exist outside of time, space, and matter.
That's interesting. I don't have my laptop on me, so I'd have to check this later. I don't think the Big Bang Theory asserts that time, space, and matter came into existence. And again, if you could fact check me on this, I think that just it asserts that at a certain point it was all concentrated into this little point in space, and then it expanded out.
Yep.
And because I've heard, it's kind of, you know, physics is not really my area, but I feel like I remember hearing like credible explanations of the fact that like this process might just be happening over and over again. And I also feel like there's a little bit of sort of the God of the gaps going on here, where it's well, we can't say where this came from, right? If we're assuming that time is linear in the first place, we might just experience time as linear. But it's like, well, if we can't explain where this stuff came from, it must have come from a god. It's like if I told you, like I have a suitcase over here. If I told you like, well, I can't tell you what's in the suitcase, therefore it's a banana. It's like, no, like a lack of information is not evidence for an assertion, like that sort of assertion. So like, you know, it's possible that we just don't understand things. I was talking to Cade about this like, I don't know, like a week or two ago, about if you took a bunch of like 5-year-olds, and to be clear, none of the 5-year-olds that get into like Time magazine for like graduating from Harvard Law, but like, you know, normal standard issue 5-year-olds. And you showed them like ChatGPT, and it was like, okay, guys, come up with an explanation for this. None of them would be able to come up with the explanation. It's beyond their understanding, right? And so that is unanswered questions in like the history of the universe, in like astrophysics and stuff. I don't think are evidence for this very specific conclusion that they're getting at. Yeah. I also like the way that they're kind of like, well, this Catholic guy came up with it. It's like
they love
it's
that.
Like, yeah, it's like, I guess it's interesting, like, but like, are they trying to like imply something, you know, like, or is it just a fun fact? I can't tell what they're doing with that.
So it's a common thing within Catholicism. They're very used to being very, how do I say it, touchy about the accusation that they're sort of anti-intellectual. And so
I wonder why.
They reassert very like firmly that actually, guys, the church is the foundation of Western science, and actually the church has been one of the greatest proponents of science and learning and knowledge. And actually, Gregor Mendel was a monk, and actually...
Cade from the future here. When I read this slide, my audio went crazy. So I'm going to read the slide that you see on screen, and then we're going to get back to the conversation because I fixed the audio. So what do we call something that is not bound by time? Timeless. Not material. Immaterial. Now, something immaterial can be one of two things. One, abstract entities like numbers. For example, 2 + 2 = 4 would be true even if the universe never existed. 2, a spiritual mind, which can recognize, compare, and act upon abstract realities. However, abstract concepts do not create things. People do. Numbers don't cause explosions, minds do. Therefore, the cause of the universe must be of the spiritual kind, the most powerful cause. Moreover, this cause must be the most powerful thing imaginable, because it created something out of nothing. Humans can rearrange existing materials, wood into furniture, words into poetry, but we cannot create being itself from nothing. Thus, the cause of all time, space, and matter must be 1, timeless, 2, spiritual, 3, omnipotent. Therefore, in short, this first cause is what we call God. Now back to the main video.
I feel like I'm having a stroke. One sec. Let me... Oh, wait. Yeah, okay, so why is it that... So they're saying not bound by time is timeless. Are they... So they have this assertion that time and space was created during the Big Bang, which I don't think is correct. And then they're saying because of that, the only way that could be is if something outside of time and space created time and space, which again, I'm not sure. Like when you really dive into this kind of high level physics stuff, which is why it's all math, which is why I don't understand it, because I hate math. But like, it's not, it's like physicists don't make like common sense arguments. Like for example, if you talk about like how a photon can be in multiple places at once. Like they know that from math, right? And so like they have these very complex kind of mathematical justifications for their assertions about the universe, and then they sort of contextualize those and translate them into like the sort of explanation you'll see like on a popular science show or like a Neil deGrasse Tyson clip or something. And so like they've really leapt over a lot of kind of showing their work here. And then also like something that is, so now we have to say something is immaterial. And then they define these kind of boundaries for what something immaterial can be, which is either an abstract entity or a spiritual mind. And I don't understand that. Like, numbers don't cause explosions, minds do. Like, what? It is this kind of feels like when like chat, not to bring up like chat GPT again, but like when like it hallucinates, you know what I mean? Like it just I feel like if I told ChatGPT like make a picture of like a girl reading a textbook and like I zoomed in on like the words, it'd be like this. Like, so yeah, I numbers don't cause explosions, minds do. Like I'm thinking about like Matilda, you know, she,
Exactly.
therefore the cause of the universe must be of the spiritual kind. It's like, yeah, this feels like.
So, like I was saying, I call this stuff word science, where you like look at, well, if we have time on a piece of paper and then we cross it out, what's the opposite of not time? Outside of time. And then you're like physical. And so a few points on this particular argument. One, the Big Bang Theory isn't characterized correctly in what it's saying here. Two, our intuitions break down about everything at this level. Like, our intuitions around, we don't see a cup pop out of space. Like, that's reasonable. But when we're talking about 3, 4, and 5 dimensions and space-time warping all the way around, and everything at the quantum level breaks down. Same thing with the beginning of the universe. This is an inappropriate usage of words. And so first, like, what does it mean for something to not have time? There's like 4 or 5 fields of philosophy on what time even is. So to say timeless is like, is that different than sans time or outside of metric time? Like, timeless is a leap. Material and immaterial, there's a whole lot of shades between there because we don't even really know what material means. And also, to be immaterial, to just say abstract entities or spiritual mind is presupposing and ruling out like 8 other competing schools of philosophy by PhD philosophers. And then to just like intuit a mind. In a lot of religion, I just see is this like anthropomorphization of the unknown, where you're just like, well, we don't know things, and then like, so it has to be a mind, as you were pointing out, Greg. Like, it just, everything breaks down, and so, like you said, it kind of feels like you're reading a stroke, or you're doing word science, and it's just leaping to these radical conclusions.
And the other thing too is that like they're saying, you know, we can't explain or conceptualize this, therefore it is this specific thing. But if you just take it one step further, then it's like, okay, well, where did God come from? Then once again we're stumped. It's like, why do we need to add this extra step? Like, why can we just say we don't understand these things? Why does it necessarily, like, why does it require this conclusion, especially when they once again arrive at the exact same issue if you just take it one step further? Do you ever trying to ask it? I'm not phrasing it well.
No, fully. So if I could steel man their position just for a second, typically these are called cosmological or arguments for God. The most famous version is called the Colin cosmological argument. I don't know if you've heard of it.
No.
It's really simple. It goes, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
It's interesting.
So they kind of skip over that by just sort of saying, well, the Big Bang starts everything, and therefore the thing that makes the Big Bang has to be XYZ. But generally, they try to establish first that, like, okay, well, the universe is not an infinite regress, and therefore it had a beginning. And since we know things that begin to exist are always caused by something else, there must have been something that began it. So that would be
right. But then what began it? Because then they're implying it's God, right?
Yes.
But then what made God?
They would say that in order for God to make the universe, he must be by nature eternal, without beginning. But then the problem obviously is that, well, then why can't the universe?
Right. It's like, why do we need this extra step?
Yeah. There
is
also a really good answer to that.
They, I find this slide to maybe be one of the worst of the entire slide deck.
Yeah.
Because of, like, they just cram in omnipotent. They just, like, cram in the fact that there's a mind.
Right.
And there's nothing in here that warrants the idea of a mind. And also, like, if you're like, yeah, I have this brain that's timeless, spaceless, spaceless, immaterial, you'd be like, so you have nothing, right? Like, right? If the way they explain God classically also sounds like he just doesn't exist, because there's no dimension, there's no reality in which he exists except for a game of special pleading and chalking it up to something else.
Well, it's interesting also the sort of, he's immaterial because he exists before material, like ontologically prior to materiality. Okay. And then they list two things. First, abstract entities. It's like, well, you're first of all assuming Platonic realism, which that is not settled. Most philosophers are not realists. They don't believe that like numbers exist in some ether somewhere, you know? And then a spiritual mind, like, why do you think a mind can exist without a brain? Like, we have no evidence that that's even possible. Like, the only minds we know of are products of brains.
And also, if you look at something can be immaterial, it can be one of two things. This is a step that everybody just needs to go to Majesty of Reason and binge watch his. I think he has a 12-hour video just on the Kalam cosmological argument. Like, there's only two conceivable things that are immaterial. It's like, I can think of 5, and I think if we sat down, we could think of 20. Like, there were so many other things than numbers or a spiritual mind. And this is like the infinite rabbit hole of philosophy. And so somebody might say, hey, you haven't thought about this argument or this particular thing. And yes, this document simplify things, but God would then expect the average person to spend their entire life reading through every single book on philosophy ever to come to the possible logical conclusion. Because as Joe Schmidt always points out, like, PhD philosophers disagree on pretty much every single word of this entire document. And they all disagree with each other. Like, it's this infinite soup of ideas that's out there. And so to say, does God exist with any degree of certainty seems intellectually dishonest from an academic standpoint.
It's also worth remembering, like, all of this sort of, well, he has to be these things, blah, blah, blah. They're trying to prove why you should join a particular political organization. Like, the end state of this is, here's why you should sign up and be baptized for this specific church.
And the thing too about the science of it that's annoying is, like, I think that most people, I'm not a scientist, but I do scientific work. I have a friend who teaches at UCLA, and we do research together. And I'm finally, I'm a college dropout, and I'm finally like finishing up my degree, so I can like go on to grad school and be like a scientist for real. Thank you. But like, I've done scientific work, and like, I think people, and I've talked to people who are like professors and scientists, and I think that most of them would agree that science is a tool that cannot investigate the claims of religion except for in like a very specific case-by-case way. Like, if you wanted to test whether or not, for example, praying for somebody improves their outcome if they have a terminal illness, you could study that, and I think people have, where they have, you know, a group of people who believe they're being prayed for but are not, and a group of people who are being prayed for and actually are. And then we can investigate that specific claim, and then we can see, okay, do we have evidence of this sort of causal relationship between being prayed for and outcome improvement? And we could say our data doesn't show evidence that praying for someone, you know, helps them, or more than like the placebo. So we can have these very kind of specific, granular conclusions or inferences about causal relationships. And then you can look at all of those and kind of form your own inference about, like, well, it seems that whenever these things are investigated, it doesn't really hold up. But then to talk about, like, well, what exists outside of time and space? Like, how do you investigate that scientifically? You can't. And so it's a little bit annoying to me when they are trying to kind of give this like patina of science, or this like aesthetic of science to these arguments, when scientific inquiry, when done correctly, is an incredibly careful investigation of an incredibly specific thing.
Yep.
And you would never see a scientist, like, or at least, you know, you never see like a respectable scientist. Every field has wackos in it, but like you would in terms of like the norms in science, you would not say like, well, reality must have been, formed by like numbers or God. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
like no. What you'll see, like if you go to like a scientific conference, what you'll see is like, we wanted to see if like dandelions grow faster under more carbon dioxide. So we had one group of 100 dandelions that had like this much carbon dioxide. Then like this other group had like 20% more carbon dioxide. And it turns out the ones that had 20% more grow a little bit faster. Like that's what scientists talk about. They don't they don't make these broad claims about the nature of existence.
I kind of want to. Oh, go for it. Great.
I was going to say, we've advanced so much on this topic. We've spent billions of dollars and hundreds of people have dedicated their lives to the origins of the universe.
Right.
And it's a rapidly progressing field that we know more and more about. And then there's this like aura that I get from these younger apologists that like they could just show up to these particle physicists in Europe at a particle collider and they just be like, guys, don't you insert like the logic tree like this of an immaterial cause, and then they get drilled on the quantum level with like one question, the whole thing collapses. And Colin, I'll let you have the last word, and then I'm going to show you the next slide, and then we're going to see the even bigger gaping hole in this particular argument.
So I just wanted to point out that, like, specifically, I think Catholics a lot too will try to have their cake and eat it too when it comes to science. Where your point, like, I think most scientists would say that they can't really even investigate most broad-based claims of religion. They love to say that themselves. Catholics will be like, well, they're true. What is it Benedict said, or was it Paul? The two wings of truth.
Oh, yeah, that's Benedict XVI said that faith and reason are the two wings that elevate the human spirit.
So the idea is that, like, well, you can know truth through science and you can attain to truth through science, and that's good, and we like that, but it can't investigate the spiritual. And so matters of the spiritual are not within the domain of science, and therefore things like evolution and cosmology and things should never affect your faith because, well, that's all in a box somewhere and doesn't actually matter to our faith. But when we want to prove God, we'll talk all day about the Big Bang Theory. So
yeah, it's kind of like the two wings of faith that fly you directly into a $3 billion sex abuse settlement.
Like that.
By the way, is Benedict, is that where Eggs Benedict is from?
No.
No? Okay.
Benedict is
maybe like in his honor, or like it was his favorite.
No.
Okay.
He only died a couple years ago.
Yeah, he was Pope from like the early 2000s.
Yeah, no, he's very recent.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that shows you how little I know about this. I had to ask Cade like a week ago. I was like, like when the guy in the Bible like dies and then they put him in the cave and like he walks out of the cave, like, was that Jesus or like was that like someone Jesus was helping? Like I didn't remember. So that
You
is my
didn't say that. You just said,
religion.
what's the name of the guy? And I was like, Jesus?
Jesus?
Yeah.
And or Lazarus?
But just I know you're supposed to have the last word on this slide, but just to your point, like to butt into your point, like, yeah, I mean, we can look at specific claims, right? If for example, if you, for evolution, like you could say a very specific claim about evolution, and we can say, well, what we've observed in genetics and the fossil record and experiments suggest this. But if you say like, well, God created the universe, it's like, well, we can't investigate that. So I think you can investigate like very specific claims, but like if you just if you take step one of my explanation, and you just shift it down to step two and you insert step one of God, like, I don't know what to do about that. It's like, okay, like I don't see a reason to believe that, but I can't, I don't know how to like investigate that.
And also in a more like practical argument, we could spend our time as a society like looking at words and then magnifying words and playing word games about the origin of the universe, or we could like launch the Hubble telescope to look at the pillars of creation, which is a beautiful photo from the telescope. Like we can do something about our lack of knowledge besides philosophize all day long.
Yeah, for example, quantum computing, the idea of there being a multiverse has been primarily an academic concept. except in the realm of quantum computing, where, for example, Google recently put out a statement where they think that they have reason to infer that their latest quantum computer is so powerful in part because it's working in multiple universes simultaneously. So like when you investigate things scientifically, you can get stuff from it, you know, whether that's like penicillin or a photo of a nebula or a powerful computer. And I think with these sort of like semantic explorations, like all you get is like you get someone to join your organization maybe, but like you're not you're not really technologically advancing society.
Well, the you know, virtue ethicists will disagree with you because what they think is you are forming people in virtue. But anyway, we'll get to that part.
Good for them.
Good for them. So this
Shall
next
we?
one. So I think we've maybe cast some doubt, and even if you read the pro-Catholic books and you go into all of the 5 ways, like, then there's counters to that seem to cast some doubt. Point number 2, are the Gospels historically reliable? We went from, like, this vague, amorphous idea directly to the Christian God. Like, we skipped over the whole idea of any other religion, any other counter theory on any of this, like, Big Bang, now let's look at the Gospels.
Well, I think they're going to argue something. Well, we'll see. We'll see what they do.
I think at this point, unfortunately, I will be a good sport and go through the rest of this with you guys because it's fun. But they've
Colin,
lost me because the bottom of the Jenga tower has not been built here.
Hopefully,
with the God is real because blah. You know, they kind of hand waved and yada yada with the whole, you know, the most important part of this.
The way it was explained to me was that you would spend more or less time on each question depending on who you're talking to. So, right, like if you're talking to someone who's an atheist or secular entirely, yeah, you have to spend most of your time on point 1. But if you're talking to someone who's like Muslim, then you would just skip to this point, you know, like you don't focus on point 1.
That makes sense.
I think that's part of the sort of dialogue tree. But yeah, anyway,
Also,
let me
get
read this.
through ideas of like divine simplicity and persons of this God and how this God operates through. And we even get through Molinism. Like, there's 8 million objections. But Colin, do you want to just assume that we'll put the Jenga blocks there, even though they failed to put them there, and now we can start building point 2.
Okay.
How do we know the Gospels are trustworthy? To determine whether the Gospels were truly written by their presumed authors, and whether we can trust their content, we will employ a twofold analysis. 1. Internal evidence. What do the Gospels themselves tell us? 2. External evidence. What do historical sources outside of the Gospels say? Of these two, external evidence carries greater weight, just as eyewitness testimony outweighs mere speculation. As Pope Leo XIII affirms, it is clear that in historical questions, such as the origin and the handing down of writings, the witness of history is of primary importance, and that historical investigation should be made with the utmost care, and that in this matter, internal evidence is seldom of great value except as confirmation. Authorship. Who wrote the Gospels? From the earliest centuries, Christians universally recognized that the Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The external evidence for this includes, in the 1st century, Papias affirms that Mark's Gospel comes from Peter's preaching. In the 2nd century, Justin Martyr calls the Gospels, quote, the memories of the apostles, unquote. Irenaeus, Tertullian, and others confirmed the same. In the 3rd century, Clement of Alexandria and Origen likewise uphold the authorship of the 4 evangelists. In the 4th century, Jerome, Augustine, Eusebius, and Chrysostom also testify to the same tradition. Additionally, internal evidence supports this tradition. The apostles' humility is evident in their writings. For example, Matthew alone explicitly names himself a tax collector and places himself lower in the list of the apostles. Likewise, John refers to himself only as, quote, the disciple whom Jesus loved, never mentioning his name.
We'll cut that segment.
You want to stop there?
So I was counting on my fingies here as you're listing off like the people who said it, and this might be plus or minus 1, but I think they listed 10 people who were like, here's the external evidence that 10 people said this, and thus like the Gospels are historically accurate. That's kind of like, I think if you like went to like a historian and you're like 10 people, you know, I'm sure at least 10 people have said they've like seen Bigfoot.
10 people that are part of the scheme, for reference. These are all Christians.
To be fair, also, the claim that they're using the 10 sources to prove isn't that the Gospels are reliable. It's that we can believe that these 4 people wrote them.
Okay. Yeah, and then it's like to bring back, and I guess I'll take you guys' word for it that it was Jesus that walked out of the cave. Like, even if you literally told me, like, hey, we have like a video of the guy was determined dead by the medical experts of like the year 2, and then he walked out and he was fine. Like, like there have been examples of like coffins dug up where they find scratch marks on the inside because the person wasn't really dead. It's like, oh, they thought he was dead and he wasn't. Like that. I think that to the extent that there's historical accuracy in the Bible, I mean, I imagine there probably is, but I don't think that is evidence for any of the supernatural claims of the Bible, right? And so what is? That's. Sorry, I'll let you jump in there.
No, I was just going to say you've already found the defeating our problem with this is that all they will go on to prove is that they think that the Gospels are reliable, and from that they infer that every single thing they ever said is true as it happened exactly.
Right. I think I saw a video once. I think it was like David Blaine or Chris Angel or something, where it was like they had Shaq like float over his house to the backyard.
Nice.
I'm like, yeah, like there's a video of that, but like, do I think like Shaq can fly? No, right? It's not. It's not. There's the simpler explanation that doesn't require this sort of supernatural aspect.
And also, when we look at, and the next section's on dating the Gospels, they're late. It would be the equivalent of like me documenting my parents' childhood memories in the best case scenario. And there's a Protestant book out there called Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I think that like no evidence from 2,000 years ago by people reporting this stuff second, third, and fourth hand demands a verdict. Because if you look at this, then you got to look at every other claim in all of history. Like the writings around Jesus are mundane at best. 2,000 years ago, there's a reason in courtrooms why we have a statute of limitations, because you can only go so far back and be reliable. In this case, we're like trying to show that documents from 2,000 years ago are somewhat reliable.
I also, before we move on, just for listeners, I do want to, if you could scroll back up, Cade.
Yes.
I just want to point out that this assertion that they're trying to prove that the specific Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the actual gospel writers is, of course, actually not the opinion of majority critical scholars. They don't actually think that those are the authors of the 4 gospels that we have, and there's a lot of reasons for it. We don't need to go into all of that because it's extremely technical and fascinating and interesting and cool, but I don't know that Greg would be...
Well, no, I get it. And also, it's just like, who cares? Like, who cares if they wrote it?
Yes.
Well, the reason is because Matthew and John would be eyewitnesses to the events. So they're like, well, if they actually wrote it, then we have to take their testimony as eyewitness testimony.
I saw this video once where I'm gonna not do this justice. It's equivalent to what I'm describing. It was something like, okay, there's 10 people and they're all like dancing in a room, and like one of them has a red ball, and like pay attention to the order that the red ball gets passed around again. In fact, pay attention to like the order the red ball gets passed around from person to person. It's something like that, where it's like, this is the video and pay attention to this specific thing. And then they say, did you notice the gorilla? And it's like, what? And then they play the video for you again, and there's literally a guy in a gorilla costume, like, dancing around. And I was like, that's not real. And I had to rewind. It's like YouTube. I had to rewind the video, and, like, I didn't believe them that they were playing the same video again. And sure enough, there is literally a guy dancing across the screen in a gorilla costume that I just didn't notice. Right, and that speaks to issues with eyewitness testimony. I mean, like, even like I've done Jubilee debates, and like I'll record a little video after I get home from it. Like, here's my experience. And I actually watched the thing, and like it differs from my memory, right? And let alone like, okay, Greg did a Jubilee debate 2,000 years ago and wrote this out, right? Like, and we just have to trust that it survived this game of telephone intact. Like, it just, even if it were true, it just doesn't seem convincing. It's like they're kind of arguing a moot point.
They will continue to keep doing that, by the way, the next few sections.
in any other explanation is more likely than this guy who was God and physical actually died and then was dead for 3 days, which actually wasn't technically 3 days, according to their own story, and then came back alive. There are 8 million other conceivable explanations, but we'll dive into dating. When were the Gospels written? The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which occurred in 70 AD. If the Gospels were written after the event, the authors would have likely mentioned its fulfillment. Since they do not, these 3 Gospels are likely composed before 70 AD. John's Gospel is consistently testified by early Christians, Irenaeus, Origen, Jerome, Augustine, to have been written last, but not much later than the others. Thus, the Gospels were written within, quote, living memory, unquote, while eyewitnesses to the event were still alive. If they'd contained fabrications, we would expect to find contemporary rebuttals, yet none exist. Yeah. Greg?
Well, like, I think, first of all, whether they were rebuttals, again, like 2,000 years ago, like...
We have no idea.
Like, if they had existed, we'd still have them, is quite a claim. And then again, it's like, okay, so someone who claims, it's still like they're still kind of making the argument that, like, well, the guy who wrote it, if it did happen, he would have seen it. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, what if it didn't happen? people are capable of lying or misremembering, or, you know what I mean? Like, what's more likely, 4 guys lied, or like, this is the true religion?
It's only 2 guys.
Inflammatory. Okay, yeah, I don't know if it's inflammatory to me to say, but I'm just being honest.
And also,
inflammatory.
This 70 AD thing,
insane.
I wasn't even expecting this in here, because
it's crazy.
Even Catholic scholars will kind of say the earliest was about 90 AD, which leaves...
Catholics tend to really want to put Mark before 70 AD, if they can. But the other ones...
at the very least, we know they were between maybe 60 and like 200. Mm-hmm. This is kind of like the spread of the Gospels. Now, it depends on who you ask, and you can go down this infinite rabbit hole. So like I said, it would be the equivalent of in 2000, something happened, and nobody else wrote about it. And then in 2060, which we're not even at yet, somebody wrote down and said they had eyewitnesses. And to your point, Greg, eyewitness testimony is incredibly unreliable in the court system. And even you can remember thing one way, and then 5 minutes later, you're like, wait, did that happen? And then you're like 60 years later, or 40 years later, whatever it is, dozens and dozens of years later, and all that we have are claims that it was eyewitnesses. We can't actually know that it was eyewitnesses. And yeah, it's a wild, like, leap just on dating these alone. And then they also seem to copy off each other. It's like, yeah, when we look at the biblical or the New Testament canon, you can spend decades of research, and it's kind of like fluff in the air type of vibe.
Cade from the future here. One of the things that wasn't addressed either in this document, and so we didn't respond to this, is this idea of, like, why would the apostles die for something that they knew was false, right? If it was false, when these people were martyred, they would have given up because they didn't want to die. Nobody wants to die for a lie. A few things here. The big hole in this argument is that we don't know that the apostles, we don't know how they died, when they died, where they died, or for what they died, or what they died for, right? Did they have the chance to repent or to clear up this lie? We don't know. Were they killed for the faith? We don't know. Like, we can't make that argument because we don't know what happened to them. And so the why would somebody die for a lie doesn't work. The other martyrs make sense, right? A lot of people die for their religion. And if you're Catholic and think other religions are false, then we know that people do die for deeply held beliefs that they find integral, or that they even believe on good reason. So we know that people die for beliefs that they don't have immediate access to. We know that the people that may have had immediate access to this, we don't know how they died, so we can't make that statement. And so, yeah, as you're filtering through this conversation, no, we don't know much about what happened in early Christianity. And we certainly don't know enough to make any sort of inferences, either abductive or deductive, about intentions, about motives, about what happened. We don't know what happened, and that's okay. And we certainly can't say we know what happened because we know what happened to these people and they died for it. So back to the video.
Also, aren't there comparably supported claims that are incompatible with Catholicism with respect to, like, there is this historical account of this mystical thing happening and we can and I'm just purely assuming this is true. I'm assuming that there are other kind of accounts of, well, this guy was actually here and lived in this place and says he saw this thing.
Oh yeah,
like that's the other thing. It's like there are. I'm assuming you could.
There's contemporary other. Apollonius of Tyre comes to mind. I think he was in like the years like 70 or whatever, and one of the people who actually met him wrote down, and we know that it was him. And wrote down, oh yes, this guy did all these things. He did all these miracles, all this stuff. Like yeah. This happened all the time.
Yeah, so like what is this is the one true religion as it literally claims in this document, then why you'd think that you couldn't make these exact same arguments for the other false religions, and yet.
And even to this day, there's claims in India where people have millions of followers because of miracle claims. Every religion has miracle claims, and even non-religions have miracle claims. And if you read any accounts of anything throughout all of history, there's times you go like, that's peculiar, and then you move on. Like, there's nothing here, and we'll get into the historical evidence for Jesus, there's nothing here that demands an answer. So a lot of times when people try to grill somebody on like, so what happened? You can kind of be like, I don't know, what happened in 500 BCE in the Amazon jungle?
Right.
You're like,
they're like, what?
You don't know.
And you're like,
none of us know.
There's a lot of like crazy claims from forever, and then you'd be like, well, it happened like 3,000 years ago, and you're like, yeah, it's kind of the point. There's so many just gaping holes in this epistemology that, to your point, Greg, would force people to come to a conclusion on the most mundane matters of history throughout forever by if we apply the same like scrutiny.
Well, and would make you accept contradictory mystical experience claims. Yeah.
Right.
Colin, do you want to read this next?
Yeah. Historical evidence for Jesus. Beyond the Gospels, several non-Christian sources attest to Jesus' historical existence. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing around 116 AD, records that, quote, Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by the sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, unquote. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing around 93 AD, states that, quote, at this time Jesus appeared, a wise man, at least if he can be so described. He was someone who performed wondrous deeds, a teacher of people who were eager for the truth, ... Pilate sentenced him to the cross, but those who had grown to love him did not cease in their affections, because he appeared alive before them on the third day. A letter from Mara bar Serapion, dated around 70 AD, also references Jesus, saying, quote, what advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given.
So they're saying there's a guy named Jesus who's pretty cool, and then they try to kill him, and then it turns out that like they thought he was dead, but he wasn't. Okay. Yeah. Like, sure, okay, that's kind of neat, I guess. It's cool.
Also, you wouldn't know this unless you were like way too obsessed with this stuff like Kate and I are, but the second quote that they have from Josephus, a large portion of that quote there is almost universally held by all scholars to be a later Christian insertion into the text.
Interesting.
This whole like, he did wondrous deeds, a teacher of people, appeared before. Yeah, no, none of that is in the original.
But even if he did, you know, it's
exactly.
Like,
even if he did,
neat.
All of these things say, hey, there are some people who are Christians. Yeah, we know that.
Maybe there was really a guy.
Yeah, none of these people had direct access to these people or to the event, so they're reporting. It would be the same thing as like a CNN reporter going to India and being like, there are reports of a miracle claim.
Yes.
All that proves is that people believe there was a miracle claim, but if we look at 116, so almost 100 years later, right? Like you think of all the conspiracy theories in modern American history where we have video evidence. We have like actually contemporary reports like the day of. And even with video footage, people can't even seem to get on board with the same narrative. And that's in recent history with video footage, let alone reports 100 years later from a different part of the area that seem to just say there was a guy. And you're like,
yeah, and a lot of this is like kind of like interesting, but doesn't really seem relevant. Like it's like whether or not the answer is yes or no, I don't see how it plays into my acceptance of the ultimate claim this purports to be leading me to accept.
And if our standard is people between 50 and 100 years later reporting on something, then to your earlier point, Greg, we're kind of screwed because then we have to accept nearly every historical claim ever and go through all of history just like, oh, people reported something happened, ergo the most unlikely thing on planet Earth happened.
I will say to that point though, I think that actually ends up happening to a lot of religious people. They just decide, okay, well, now that I know, quote unquote, that my religion's the true one, any further stories that I hear from this religion, I'm just going to believe them.
Interesting.
That happens a lot. Anyway, shall we continue with the...
Yes, Colin, if you want to keep reading this section here.
Manuscript evidence. Can we trust our copies? To confirm the reliability of ancient texts, scholars look for two key factors: the number of surviving copies and the time gap between the original writing and our earliest existing manuscripts. The more copies and the shorter the gap, the more confident we can be in the text's accuracy. For comparison, consider some widely accepted ancient works. Livy's Roman History, written around 50 BC, has an earliest surviving copy dated to about 400 years later, with only 20 good copies available. Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, written around 50 BC, has an earliest copy from approximately 900 years later, with only about 10 good copies. Thucydides' History, written around 400 BC, has the earliest copy dating to about 1300 years later, with just 8 copies. Despite these significant gaps and relatively few copies, historians do not question the reliability of these texts. Now compare that to the Gospels. The New Testament was written between 33 and 100 AD. Our oldest manuscript is from just 100 years later, and we have over 5,000 ancient Greek copies. One of our oldest Gospel manuscripts, the Papyrus Botimer II, contains 14 chapters of John's Gospel, written just 100 years after John's original. Two complete New Testaments, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, date to 350 AD, only a couple centuries after Christ. Because of this overwhelming manuscript evidence, historian Frederick Kenyon concluded, quote, "The interval between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be negligible. The last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed." Similarly, scholar Craig Blomberg writes, "If the New Testament books do not have sufficient evidence to reconstruct with a high degree of accuracy their original contents, then let us not pretend to know anything about what any ancient work originally contained." Conclusion. I just wanted to finish the section.
Go for it.
If someone were to claim that the historical evidence for Jesus is insufficient, they would also have to claim that Julius Caesar never existed. If they were to reject the Gospel's reliability, they would have to discard most of what we know about the ancient world. Thus, both internal and external evidence confirmed that the Gospels are authentic, historical, and reliable.
Well, they just said there's like a bunch of copies of it.
Yeah.
Like, I'm a millennial. I'm ashamed to say, but we have copies of Harry Potter. It's more my husband's thing, but like there's a lot of copies of those. That doesn't mean the boy who lived is real. And like I also get it's like the whole thing about like the kind of historical accuracy of Jesus as a guy. Like, oh yeah, he's a guy, and like there's a guy named Jesus, and like everyone really liked him, and he was, you know, he like, did cool things for people, and he did things that people didn't even understand how he was doing them, and then they thought they killed him. Then it turns out he wasn't killed. Like none of that kind of goes onto like the fault line of belief and non-belief, right? It's just, so then it's like when they're saying like death at the end in the conclusion, it's like they're almost asking us to forget what they actually, you know, asserted evidence for, which are kind of relatively unremarkable. I mean, perhaps interesting, but relatively unremarkable claims.
Yep. Yeah, the central problem here is that they're saying, because we know that some people around 100 years afterwards were able to say that a guy named Jesus was around and he got killed, and then people thought he came back to life. That means that every single word of the Gospels is definitely real and was exactly happened the way that they are written, as like every supernatural claim in the Gospels is therefore just as reliable, which is like, that doesn't follow at all.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
No.
On the historical note, there is critical analysis of every book about ancient history, right? You have these old works, and from time to time they're like, and the emperor was so great that he levitated to heaven and the society flourished. And you're kind of like, that's kind of a claim. and we're not going to take that one. And they're like, and then this person existed, and you're like, okay, we'll kind of take that to exist. And same thing with, people make the argument, instead of Julius Caesar, with Genghis Khan, whether he existed or not. When you talk to historians, and they admit, like, he's kind of this, like, amalgamation of stories and tales around a particular time that seems to explain the data. And then you're like, and how confident are you that he existed? And it's like, I don't know, we kind of, like, for the sake of the conversation, say that he existed. And then you talk to these, like, New Testament scholars, and you're like, so did Jesus exist? And like, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, I've built my life around this man 2,000 years ago.
Well, the thing is, even if he did, it's like, so what? That's the thing where it's like I feel like almost in getting bogged down in debating the claim, it almost feels like it's almost like you've just lost by accepting the premise, right? Because again, it could be kind of academically interesting. Mm-hmm. But in supporting your claim that you are the one true religion, it is completely irrelevant. Because I'd say that in common parlance, when this seems intended for a general audience, this document, in common parlance, to say, we're the one true religion, we're the one true explanation, it's implying that the supernatural claims of your religion are true.
Yep.
And this does not touch that at all.
Yep.
It also didn't touch on if the gospel authors were lying. Right? All it said is 60 years later, we have documents and they were replicated and seem to point to real places. Is a separate claim than the Gospels themselves accurately portray what happened at the time.
Yeah, because you can
by
grant
people that had
all of this
motivations. Right, I think we also have to look at the motivations, right? If I'm accused of a crime, and then I pull my 7 best friends together, and we write out a document to the police, a week later, the police are going to be like, hey, you kind of have a vested interest in everything being true. Even though I wrote it a week later, even though we went to the local library and printed off flyers and put it all across the web, or across the city, and then posted on the web, it was written by contemporary standards. There's people that can verify that it existed, and there's a lot of copies. And then you kind of go like, damn, except you're still accused of a crime. Like, of course your homies would back you up.
The other thing, too, is like, it's okay to say, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Like, okay, if these people, let's grant, for the sake of argument, that these people really existed and they were really in a position to have witnessed these things they claimed to have witnessed, and then they went around professing that they saw it. Why would they have done that? I don't know, right? And you just say that. I don't know. Like it doesn't. Well, it must be because it's true. It's like, no, we don't know that, right? It's okay to, you don't need, like if they're asserting that this very specific thing happened, I don't need to like counterclaim that this very specific other thing happened. I can just say I don't know, and so that is my honest answer. If they somehow established, all this stuff, like it'd be like, okay, like I mean, not the thing about God exists, but like the sort of, the kind of historical accuracy of, did people who were in a position to see these things say that they saw these things? And then has that account sort of survived the telephone game in the modern day? Like, sure, but like, why? What's your answer for that? I don't know. It's fine. Well, you can just not know things.
Well, I was just reading Making God Real, which is this book on like the language and cognitive functions of religion from like an anthropomorphic or an anthropology kind of like field of study. And one of the examples they bring up is this itinerant, I believe it was a rabbi in recent history, I think in the early 2000s, who was said to have died. And then people kept claiming that he existed and continue this belief. And they're like, what do you make of the fact that our rabbi who died kept appearing, and Susan down there got a good recipe for banana bread from the rabbi? And you're like, I don't know. Like, I don't even close to an answer, and that happened like a few decades ago, right? Like, all of these claims are mundane, and also in here we've kind of sidestepped the fact that the Gospels are all don't contradict each other, which they very clearly do from a plain text reading. That they understand what was happening, because people can read the same text and get to wildly different conclusions. Mm-hmm. And there's people that believe in Jesus, like Muslims, who say he's a great prophet, and they look to the Gospels. Also, but they don't go, ergo Trinity, worship Jesus, and take away people's rights.
Also, if I may ask, my sense, and I'm not like saying this rhetorically, I'm asking, isn't it true that for the average person, their faith is not a function of this kind of like pseudo intellectual like logic flowchart, right? Because like when I meet people who are religious, a lot of times it has to do with sort of, like a personal religious experience they've had or something like that. Like, I don't think they're like, well, if do like a textual analysis of all of the iterations of the gospel, like, I don't think that this is why people are religious who are religious, right? I don't think it's this sort of like rational, walking to this conclusion. I think that people, because like when I was religious, and again, I was not religious in this way that you guys were religious, it got to the point where it was almost this like altered state where like I just had this experience of like a presence. You know what I mean? And like our minds are capable of a lot of things. Our minds are capable of, dreaming is just a photorealistic hallucination that you can interact with, right? Our minds can do many things. And I just kind of came to the conclusion that this kind of experience of religion that I had it seems just most likely to me that it's an extension of my mind's capacity to do these other things, right? And I think that is why people are often religious. I don't think that it's like, well, if we look at the Big Bang, like it just seems weird to me that they're taking this approach in the first place.
I'd put it this way that a lot of Christians, and I don't mean to say everybody, but a lot of Christians tend to like outsource their intellectualism around these issues and like vicariously live through scholars. Where
Right.
to an extent, I remember when I was religious, like you do kind of from time to time feel uncertain about these like very specific supernatural claims. And then you hear that smart people who looked at the claims still believe in what you believe, and then you feel a little bit more certain. You're like, so-and-so
Right.
has 8 PhDs in
Right.
the New Testament manuscripts and agrees with me. You never
It's like this.
really...
It's like this
Yeah.
motivated reasoning sort of thing where you're looking for it and you find it, and it's like, okay, I found it. I'm not going to look at that
Yeah.
anymore.
Fully.
And it also seems to sidestep the fact that if you just, whether it's cosmologists on the on the origins of the universe, there are so many competing schools of thought that people have spent their entire lives and careers and disagree with you, and there's some that have spent their entire lives and careers and agree with you. And same thing
Right.
on just the evidence for Jesus or the Gospels. It's like you poll the body of people that study this stuff for a living, and it is so varied and once again strange that like God would allow the people that interact with all of this to all disagree, but yet he somehow expects you to come to the right conclusions above and beyond somebody who has a PhD and an entire career in this field, but somehow you just know the correct answer. Or it's
apologetics as a whole is not, they pretend it's to convince non-believers to believe. It's not actually. The point of apologetics actually is to reinforce belief of believers. It's to say,
Interesting.
oh, well, we actually have good reasons to believe these things. And actually, these things exist. And so you can read them. And because you already want it to be true, you read through it and you're like, okay, this makes sense with my, my biases that I'm already bringing to it.
Right.
So you just kind of like, yep.
I remember when I first was getting into apologetics, because you hear this idea out there that, like, we have good reasons for our faith. And I remember buying this talk from Trent Horn on the historical evidence for Jesus. And I watched it with my mom. I got my notepad out. I'm like, we're about to dive into history. And then he pulls out, like, 2 people in this hour-long lecture. And you're kind of like, my mom was like, that's all? And I remember feeling like, oh, I was like expecting more because I'd heard about it. And they actually read the sources like this. And it's like, meh. And so I think on the first 2 points, Greg, how would you rate the setting up of the Jenga tower?
I think they've miserably failed. I think it's like they're using, like, it reminds me of when somebody tries to sell you like one of those little like rubber like bracelets with like the magnets in it for sports, and they're like, well, like it like hydrolyzes your electrolytes and whatever, right? And it's like, oh, like you're just using words that sound sciencey but are not, and it sounds like they're just trying to establish kind of this like pseudoscientific kind of hand wavy, speed run through the foundational question of it. And then after that, it's just kind of moot points. It's like, it reminds me of Jordan Peterson. Like, if I did ever get the chance to talk to Jordan Peterson, I think I'd say something, similar. Like, I guess it's interesting that, like, God can be defined as, like, valuing stuff. But, like, what's your point? Right? Even if I grant you that, it doesn't challenge my conclusion. And I would say the same thing about, like, the kind of, the kind of historical accuracy of, like, there was a guy named Jesus and they thought he died, but he didn't. It's like, okay, like, stranger things have happened. Right? Like, it has not accomplished its purported task of converting me, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel like instead of laying these Jenga blocks, they just kind of like poured out soup on the table.
Yeah.
And then like kept stacking some wet Jenga blocks in like a pile. And I know that in the comment section, somebody's going to be like, have you read this book? Have you read this book? Like, there's actually more and more. And the answer is like, yeah. Like, I spent years, and I still have my entire shelf over there, just full of these books. So when you're like, and the first point could have been fleshed out, it's like, I've read thousands of pages on this thing, and I'm still at the same conclusion. Like, you might be able to criticize Greg. Don't criticize Greg because he's nice, that he's seen this for the first time. Colin and I have read all of this stuff, and you get to the same point, which is kind of like, huh.
There's also value. There's also the flip side of me being relatively ignorant about this is there's also value in an outside perspective, right? And the fact that, like, if you are watching this and you are really into this stuff, you might have sort of talked yourself into being convinced of certain things. And hearing me, like, I don't really have a dog in this fight. Like, I don't, my personal opinion is that, religion's not for me. And for some people, religion is helpful. And for some people, it's not. We can have a conversation about whether religion's a net good for the world. I think that's almost sort of an academic conversation. I don't see the utility. So it's like, I'm not this like raging, like, anti-theist. I'm just a guy. And this thing purports to convince people like me of this, like, amazing, like, it's supposed to railroad me. And I'm approaching it honestly, and I'm seeing a million issues with it. And whether or not I read a bunch of other stuff, it doesn't change the fact that there are issues with what I pointed out, right? I could read a book by, like, like Friar Vesuvius or whatever. Like, that's not going to change the fact that these claims don't make sense.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so we'll end episode 1 here. We got more claims on did Jesus claim to be God and all sorts of other fun inventions in episode 2 that we'll do eventually. You can follow Greg on TikTok. Is it Greg Video 1 is your TikTok?
Greg from Video 1. Yeah, so I was in my first Jubilee video. People were writing in the comments. And I was like, I want to write in the comments. What should my username be? So, like, well, I'm from the video. And then Greg from Video was taken. So Greg from Video number 1. Yeah.
I love that. You can find me nowhere. Don't talk to me.
Yeah, don't try to talk to
Leave me
Colin.
alone.
He doesn't want to hear it. But if you do want to give me bucket loads of money, there's my Patreon. Join for $1 a month gets you into the Discord server. If you have more questions about this stuff and want a response to 8 objections and rebuttals to the rebuttals of the rebuttals of the main argument, I'm in there, whole $1 a month. You can ask all of your apologetic questions, and the higher tiers of support get you early access to videos and to make all of this work possible because YouTube gives me on average $4 whole dollars a video. And nothing in the studio is less expensive than $4. So Patreon tends to be quite helpful. And I guess we will see you guys in the next episode.
All right. See you soon.
Welcome to the Intrinsically Ordered podcast for part 2 of Colin and I, who are ex-traditional Catholics, trying to steelman and convert Greg, who's been a lifelong atheist, somewhere in that realm. So in part 1, if you haven't watched it, start there because this is going to make absolutely no sense if you don't watch part 1, which is going through this document that purports to bring you from agnosticism to Catholicism in 5 steps. Part 1 and 2 on does God exist and the historical reliability of the Gospels. Greg had some pushback, to put it lightly, on those points. And so Greg's utterly not sold on points 1 and 2. But today, we're going to be taking Greg from the Gospels may have happened all the way to Catholicism
I'm really
in this
excited.
document.
I'm very excited to become a Catholic. It sounds like there's all sorts of activities, and you make new friends, and there's a lot going for it. So I'm excited to be converted and to join the ranks.
Lots of activities for sure.
Yeah, and in the same disclaimer as last time, this document that was sent to us is representative of Catholic arguments. By no means is it exhausted. And if you comment down below with 5 more books to read, you're getting banned from this channel because this isn't addressing every argument. This is kind of Colin and I soft launching Catholic arguments to Greg.
Yeah.
So this is by no means exhausted, and we're not claiming it to be.
It's the Spark Notes.
Yeah, this is the Spark Notes version. And to Greg's earlier point from last time, if you're not even genuinely convinced by the Spark Notes, more details isn't going to help your case.
Right.
Any other thoughts from you two on how part 1 went before we prove the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church in this episode?
I think it's going to be an uphill battle, but I have faith in the strength of the arguments. I think we're going to get a Catholic by the end of this.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm rooting for the maker or makers of this document. I want them to get me.
Perfect. Well, let me share this here. We got point number 3. Did Jesus claim to be God? In his book, Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis famously wrote, quote, "Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse," unquote. This argument, often called Lewis's trilemma, contends that Jesus must have been a lord, a liar, or a lunatic based off of his claims. However, some more modern scholars, such as Professor Bart Ehrman, argue against this premise. Ehrman writes, quote, "Jesus probably never called himself God. This means that he doesn't have to be either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. He could be a first-century Palestinian Jew who had a message to proclaim other than his own divinity," unquote. Yet, in all bold, the Catholic faith has always affirmed that Jesus is truly God, as definitively proclaimed in the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century. Quote, "Jesus is light from light, true God from true God, consubstantial with the Father." So who is correct? To answer this question, let's examine the evidence from Scripture, specifically what Jesus claimed about himself, and did he prove it? Yeah, I'm just going to send that one right to Greg for your raw thoughts. Jesus, Lord, liar, or lunatic?
First of all, for the audio listeners, there's some beautiful graphic design on this slide. Jesus' arm extends beyond the frame. It's a very nice sort of 3D effect. Yeah. I'm not quite sure of the. I mean, it's an interesting assertion, an interesting framing that he's he's God or he's a liar or a lunatic. I think that we also have to consider the Petersonian definition of God, right? Maybe he's just someone's highest priority, or maybe he's talking about liking going to museums, right? So we don't really know what words mean. But if we're going to take the reductionist, atheist, materialist, rationalist, literalist point of view, I do find C.S. Lewis's trilemma interesting, and I see his logic. And I'm also curious if this intersects with the Chronicles of Narnia in some way, assuming this is the same C.S. Lewis.
It's the same C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
Were you a Narnia kid?
Not really. I think maybe I read it briefly. I might have flipped through it a bit.
The lion is Jesus.
It's a Jesus story.
Oh.
I mean, literally, the lion is literally Jesus. It's not an allegory. He is literally Jesus.
Who's
He
the
sacrifices himself.
The witch is just the witch. She's emblematic of the serpent.
Okay.
Yes.
But she is not the serpent.
I was hoping when I was reading Chronicles of Narnia that Judas in this story would fall and have his guts spill out, but for some reason Judas was forgiven. But
but not Susan, because she wore makeup, and that's bad. You can't wear makeup.
Makeup bad. Greg, do you want to try to tell me what you think Jesus' light from light, true God from true God means?
No. I don't know what that means at all.
There's this Catholic YouTuber that's like, when people ask you, what do you believe as a Catholic? I say, I believe in one God, the Father, and just goes through this, the Nicene Creed. And you're like, what the hell is Jesus' light from light, true God from true God mean?
Consubstantial with the Father.
Yeah.
It's this weird. So
Is
Is it a tautology?
Yes,
it is. It's quite literally the definition. of it's tautological.
The point that it's making is that Jesus is God in the way that light, like, I think the idea is like you can have a light source and it can illuminate things, and the illumination of other things doesn't diminish the initial light source. The idea is that propagation in that way of Jesus from the Father, and it's sort of an eternal it's really weird. Trinitarianism is weird.
This reminds me of after in high school, way back in the Bronze Age of 2011. I took my AP like Lang test or something, and then I went to like a Facebook group where people were discussing how they had answered the prompts, and it was completely different than what I thought it was. And I feel like that's happening to me right now.
Mm. Yeah, so the idea is like consubstantiality with the Father, like, oh, God the Father and Jesus share the same substance, as in they are both God at the same time.
What is the Trinity, by the way? I don't understand that at all.
No one can.
Christians don't. And the dumb thing about the Trinity is that Christians can't come up with an analogy, because you can't analogize the Trinity without becoming a heretic. Have you ever heard like St. Patrick had like the 3-leaf clover, and he kind of used that to like teach about the Trinity? Except
I know about the 4-leaf clover and St. Patrick's Day. That's why I don't know about the 3-leaf clover.
No, the 3-leaf is St. Patrick's thing. His whole thing was he had a 3-leaf clover, and he's like, look, the clover is one clover, but there are 3 leaves, just like God is one God, but there's the Father.
But that's actually modalism. It's a heresy.
Isn't it partialism?
Oh,
it's partialism.
Whatever it is, it's the idea that like each person in the Trinity is part of God.
Partialism.
And so Christianity, like, the Trinity is a post-invention of Christianity. At the time, nobody had the idea that the Trinity existed. And so we take it for granted in like a Western context, like Jesus is God, and God the Father is God, and the Holy Spirit is God, which we don't even know what that means. B, that didn't come around for, as they say, the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, so 300 odd years later. They're kind of like, oh, remember the time Jesus said this? He actually meant this, despite nobody actually knowing what that meant. But kind of going through this, first on Lewis's trilemma, you have liar, lunatic. You can also throw, or Lord, you can also throw in legend in there. And then he also wants you to pick one of the 4. You know, like you could have a pie chart of any of those. Also, to our earlier point from last time, the evidence around Jesus is first his existence, and then anything that he said is so scant that we don't have to answer the question, right? When you're like, what happened to this random person from 700 BC in the Amazon rainforest? Were they this or that? And you're like, I don't know, like there's not great evidence. Like they might have existed, but like what precisely did Julius Caesar do on the 12th of April in this year is like, I don't know. I don't have to come to a decision. And it's probably a combination of all of them. And then the other point that Colin and I were pointing out is that they quote Bart Ehrman as like this later invention of a person that says that Jesus might not have been Lord. But historically, there's always been debates on if Jesus is God. Namely, 1, Judaism, namely 2, Islam, namely 3, every other religion on the face of the earth and how they treat Jesus and the rest of society. So it's Bart Ehrman's not the first guy to make this argument.
Can I ask you can you remind me, what are 4 and 5 again? And this
the questions. 4 is
thing?
4. It says did Jesus establish a church, and did that church have the charism of infallibility?
What is the charism of infallibility?
We will get there.
I'm sorry, 5.
5 is that church the Catholic Church?
Okay, so I was confused about was for 2, where it was like, you know, the Gospels are historically accurate. So they're saying in 2 that Jesus performed miracles and did supernatural things, right?
They're saying, I think mostly what they want is that every word that Jesus says in the Gospels, he actually said. That's what they want to make point 3. Because what they do then is, well, if Jesus says that he's God, then he has to either be lying, insane, or God. And therefore, because we know the Gospels are accurate representations of what he said, we could just look at what the Gospels say and we can see if he claimed to be God. And then we can deduce which is the most likely of the 3 options.
Does number 2 also establish that he did these like miraculous things? Is that part of it as well?
Yes.
That's what they kind of hoodwink you into, right?
Okay.
Point number 2, are the Gospels historically reliable? The central argument is just people wrote them within 100 years of his death, and there was a bunch of copies of them.
Right.
Which is a very,
And certain basic historical details match up to other things.
Yeah, because I was thinking, like, if he did all these things, if he, like, walked on water and, like, came back to life, but then he was like, I'm not God, that'd be fascinating. Like, then what is he? You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. So that's essentially it. I think all that they want you, if you want to be super, like, bare bones, if you want to just say, like, point 1, you have to sort of give it to them that God exists. Like, obviously they didn't prove that, but, like, we'll just give it to them. And point 2, I think all you have to really give them is, reading the Gospels, we can accurately know what Jesus said. I don't think that you don't necessarily even have to give him miracles, I think, for this point to follow.
Yeah.
So we're establishing that one of are they agreeing with C.S. Lewis that it must be one of these 3 things?
Yes, that's their argument.
Okay.
And they're trying to force your hand to make a decision, because if you say liar, then it's kind of like, well, he did miracles. And then if you're like lunatic, and then you're like, how dare you blaspheme Jesus? And then you're kind of like, I don't know, he seemed a little wacky. Like, even if you read the book, he's a little
but first,
he's a little out there.
They have this point. They're saying certain people will say that, well, we don't even know if Jesus claimed to be God, because certain people will argue, reading the Gospels, nowhere in the Gospels does he actually claim to be God. That is an argument scholars will make. And so point 3 is just, they're going to try to show you that in the Gospels, he actually makes the claim that he's God.
Okay.
And,
interesting.
And so their next point here, and we'll skip over the rest, but they say Christ claims to divinity. In the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself with 3 key titles that reveal his divine identity. 1, the Son of Man. 2, the Son. 3, I am. Let us examine these titles meant and how Jesus used them. So keep in mind, there is not a Bible verse where he says, I am God, and I'm consubstantial with the Father, and there's 3 people of the Trinity. Like, everything that we take for granted in Western Christianity about Jesus and God, and their, like, weird kind of, like, love triangle type of vibe, but it's not clear, wasn't apparent in the early church. And so they kind of have to, like, squint at these titles and references. Like, if I said, I'm the Son of Man, it's like, am I God? I don't know. Same thing with the Son. And
Maybe you're the son of a man. Maybe you're the son of a man, right?
The Son of Man title, it's very funny that they're trying to use the Son of Man to be like, this means he's God, because there is so much debate on what that phrase even means in the use as used in the Gospels, which this is the kind of stuff that, like, I don't know how much of a response you're going to have because you didn't grow up. You've never read the Gospels, right?
No.
So, and a lot of this is like very specific, like debates about Jewish religious philosophy at the time of the turn of the century. So like, it's a very sort of technical debate about scholarship. And it's also kind of unnecessary because the main argument is Lewis's trilemma, right? So you could just give it to them. Okay, let's say Jesus claimed to be God. But then you're left with Lewis's trilemma, and they still have to make the argument for which one you should pick, right?
Yeah, right. And so point 1, especially on the Gospels, is all they did is, like, the Gospels might have portrayed some historical things. Is as far as they got. But what they're trying to do, and if you look at, like, the field of biblical scholarship where people take it literally, is that the Gospels, word for word, are what Jesus said, except even as they dated it as early as 30 years after his death. It would be like your 50-year-old parent recounting a story of what their friend told them in high school. And then people 2,000 years later, like, and the friend actually put an Oxford comma on this. And like, there's people telling a story minimum 30 years later, potentially 100 years later, secondhand. And so part of this whole thing is it's so weird to, like, scrutinize every word, because all they did was, like, the Gospels reported something. And we won't read through each one of these points, but Colin, if you want to give a quick overview of the invention of or the change of Christ's view of deity over time, and then each of the 3 titles, and then we'll just kind of skip ahead a few pages.
Really quick, the things that he called himself reminds me of like when rappers call themselves things. You know, like it's your boy. You know, it's like Jay-Z, like young ho. You know, like,
literally,
the son of man.
That actually kind of goes hard.
It does.
So just so like for people watching, just if they to respond to the points here, they're arguing that because in the Gospels Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man and the Son in relation to discussing God as the Father, and the famous phrase in John where he says, "Before Abraham was, I am," which is So
maybe you're saying he's older.
In all of these phrases, other people in the Bible and angels have used these same titles and not claimed to be God.
So
like the idea,
the Son of Man one is simplest to sort of not dismiss. It's obviously a robust field of scholarship and discussion. I'm not trying to dismiss it, but the Son of Man is a figure you first see in the Bible in the book of Daniel. He comes up in Daniel's visions as sort of a messianic figure. So the Son of Man is tied very much into like Jewish messianism, which is the idea that like, a descendant of David will come and liberate the Jewish people from oppression. This is the role that Christianity puts onto Jesus and says that he is the Messiah, that he fulfilled that role, but they sort of spiritualize it. And they say that, yes, he saved us from sin and whatever, but historically, the Messiah was a purely political figure. Like, he is prophesied to be a king that liberates literal Israel and frees literal Israel from its oppressors and like creates the Davidic kingdom again. And the Son of Man is this figure that's like referenced in a lot of Second Temple Jewish literatures, like the Book of Daniel and the Book of Enoch, which is not in the Bible, but also talks about the Son of Man, and some, I think, fourth Esdras, which is in the Orthodox Church's scripture, also refers. There's the angel Uriel shows Ezra a whole vision of like the Son of Man and stuff. So it's this figure that's tied into messianism. So clearly Jesus is using it, or the authors are putting the words in Jesus' mouth to identify him with the Messiah. Catholics will go on to then claim that the Messiah is meant to be God or divine in some way, which no, that was never a Jewish idea.
The Jews didn't believe that, which is weird that like Catholics will come in and then tell people what they should have thought at the time. And then you're like, maybe the people at the time that wrote the book had a better understanding than some Catholic in 2025. Like, I don't know. It would be like me writing a book and then somebody 2,000 years later is like, well, Kate actually meant this. And you're like, damn, man, that's not what I said. Like,
so to just summarize what they're establishing so far, if we take them at their word, which I do not grant them that they have convinced me of points 1 and 2. But are they saying, so if I am convinced of everything so far in this pamphlet, then I would say, okay, God exists, and the people who wrote the Bible are the people who we think wrote the Bible, and they would have been there when these things happened, and that means that Jesus said he was God. Is that what we're at? Am I missing anything?
Nope, that's where we're at.
Okay, because even if I grant all of that, it's like, okay, like, and? You know what I mean? It's like...
This is why Kate and I were kind of like, this section is really dense and technical and also kind of entirely besides the point.
Yeah, because like,
not helpful.
Because I was thinking, like, at first, I was like, I'm getting caught up on this. Like, I wanted to relitigate everything from part 1 and 2, because it all builds on that, right? But then I realized, like, even if I don't, it's still just sort of, like, it goes from being unsubstantiated to just kind of unremarkable.
and so same thing like the term the Son and then I am, which like you could write entire books just on this, and we'll send everybody to Dan McClellan to go nerd out on Trinitarian debates around I am in
I am
the
is their
tetrahedra boogeyman.
Tetragrammaton. Okay.
Yes, tetragrammaton.
That'd be an awesome metal band name.
I guarantee it's been in metal names.
Tetragrammaton.
And then the other one that sounds like Megatron. It's like the Meta something Tron.
Optimus Prime's dad.
Yes.
So yeah, basically the argument of the Son is their argument is just God's called the Father and Jesus calls himself the Son, and that means he's saying I'm different from the Father, but I'm also divine, which yes, that is what he's saying. Their argument though is that he's literally the same God as the Father.
So is Jesus fully God, or is it like Horcruxes in Harry Potter, like they're like parts of God?
Jesus is both 100% God, but also 100% human.
He has two natures.
And also,
can
I know
Jesus, can the three of them like be in the room at the same time?
they
Three of
cannot.
them are always in the room together at the same time, and also not. It's more or less like Schrodinger's cat.
Yes.
But like, which person in the Trinity are you talking to? Because they're not separate entities, right? Like the Holy Spirit can't do something apart from the other ones, but he also can.
He can. It's confusing because it doesn't actually make sense. So their point here is just that the Son is not the Father and the Son is divine. Sure, that seems to be an intention that the text was trying to convey. But divine and is God are not the same. And I think
I'm just closing the door, but I'm still listening. One second.
And also another side point here, not to go too far down like the rabbit hole, is that this idea that nowadays when Christians talk about God, he is like the first cause, he is the omnipresent, all powerful, all good, present everywhere God, but also outside of time, space, and matter. Like with this monotheistic God is not historically how Jewish tradition has viewed God. Because there's been multiple gods, and in the Old Testament, the different gods fight each other. So monotheism, even at the time of Christ, wasn't widely accepted now. And so for Jesus to be divine, you could grant points 1, 2, and part of 3 and say like, yeah, Jesus claimed to be divine. And so in the modern mind, it's like, oh, if he's God, then he's God. But back in the day, there was degrees and shades of divinity that Christ wouldn't have exhausted the category of God, and wasn't something could be God, but not Yahweh, but also Yahweh wasn't all of the idea of spirituality out there in this idea of deity. And so you kind of just have this like infinite word salad. Same thing with I am. He's not actually identifying as Yahweh.
It kind of, the I am is their strongest argument.
Yeah.
But there are lots of ways in which the I am claim might be interpreted.
Was he like answering a question like, who's God? So, I am.
No, so the context is something like he's talking about how like, oh, such and such happened in the beginning of time or whatever. And the chief priests are like, were you there? Like, how can you say these things? And he says, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So like the tense is different than he would say like, I was, because it's a reference to in the book of Exodus, famously, when Moses sees the burning bush, he sees God and he's like, who are you? Like, what do I call you? What do I tell thee? Is like, because God sends him to free the Israelites from Egypt. He's like, well, who do I tell them you are? And God says, tell them that I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you.
If we accept point 2 in this document that like the Bible is generally, like broadly seems like it's probably, somewhat historically accurate. Like, that's not establishing that every single word in it is exactly what happened, right?
Yeah, but don't think about that, because that is what we apparently established.
And also, if you grant every word of the gospel, it's still not clear what Jesus thinks that he is,
right?
Even if you grant all of it. Because if all of these points seem confusing, Greg, it's because it is. Jesus could have just said, I am God, and clarified all of this stuff long ago. Because all these inventions about what Christ is and how it's changed over the centuries in the Trinity, he could have just laid it out there. He could have made it really clear. And so by virtue of them having to like squint super hard at these old Jewish ideas is kind of proof that he wasn't straightforward about what he thought that he is. Which seems problematic, right? Like if I show up to work and I walk into a company building and then I like vaguely hint at the fact that I'm not part of the company, but I also kind of hint like, maybe I am your boss. And then kind of like, well, what if I'm just a new employee? People are going to be like, can you answer a question? Right? Like, do you own the company or not? And if I own the company, I'd be like, yeah, I own the company. I'm the CEO. In this case, Jesus is kind of like Jordan Peterson style. I forget what words mean when I get asked a question.
Is the counter to this basically like, well, it's a test, and or we're not meant to understand it? Is that sort of the way? Okay.
Well, the idea would also, they would say something like, this would have been language. They would make a claim like, oh, well, any person back then who heard him say things like this would know that he was claiming to be God, and therefore he was just using the language of the time, which is not true, actually, because plenty of scholars will say that the idea that Jesus, first of all, as the Gospels go from like earliest to latest, the divineness of Jesus becomes more pronounced. You can tell. Like in the first one, he definitely seems pretty human. Like, yeah, he has magic powers or whatever, but it's not like he's pre-existed.
It's like Harry Potter level stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
But,
He hasn't gone to Hogwarts yet.
well, famously, the first gospel opens with God's sort of power descending onto Jesus. And he's like, you are my son, I choose you. So it's almost like, oh, this guy has been given God powers now to go do
Pikachu mode.
I was gonna say, I choose you. Yeah.
But then by the last one,
interesting.
you have him saying things like, I am who pre-existed. The last gospel opens with this like really complicated sort of platonic.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
And through him was all things made, and without him was not a thing made that has been made.
I love the grammar of these. It reminds me of like when I'm learning like other languages. What helps me is to literally think like word. I'll think word for word in the language, like in English, like translate it. And I feel like that's what you guys are doing.
Yeah, well, it's because it's written in ancient Greek, and so
Right.
Anyway,
so the New Testament kind of like ramps up in the Gospels his divinity. And then the rest of the books kind of just like go like this, trying to explain what Jesus was at times.
It's like Revelation, and it's like, whoa, okay.
Yeah. And then you're like on
crazy.
A full-on acid trip by the time you get to Revelation.
Okay. You're selling me on this book. I'm starting to realize why it's popular.
If you have a free time and you want to read some crazy stuff, just read the book of Revelation, the last book in the Bible. It's a fun time. It's about the end of the world. Sort of, not really, but kind of.
Okay, I'm down for that.
But also, what even is the world? The same thing, like, did Jesus rise from the dead?
Right.
So at the very least, or it moves into here. So for people listening, we scrolled over where they prove each of the 3 points of the Son of Man, the Son, and I am. Because it's dense and so heavily debated that I think we've cast doubt on it.
And we can also just grant it. Just grant that he claimed to be God. And then we can...
There's a guy, I went on vacation in Hawaii, and in Maui, there's a guy who claims to be God.
Hell yeah.
He has a sign. Yeah.
And so, back into the document here. Did Jesus prove his divinity? It is one thing to claim to be God. It is another thing to prove it. Jesus demonstrates his divinity by, 1, performing miracles. Only God has power over nature, yet Jesus calms storms, heals the sick, and raises the dead. 2, forgiving sins. Only God can forgive sins, yet Jesus does so repeatedly. 3, fulfilling prophecy. Jesus precisely fulfills Old Testament predictions of the Messiah, including his death and resurrection. Most significantly, Jesus predicts and accomplishes his own resurrection. Quote, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life, that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again." Unquote. Only God has power over life and death. By rising from the dead, Jesus offers the ultimate proof that he is who he claimed to be. Conclusion, the trilemma revisited.
Maybe we want to
how do we know that?
On this point.
How do we know that only God? And also the thing too, like the first thing is like, well, because of this weird like semantic thing, like there has to have been a God to create reality. What if there were 2 of them and just one of them was lazy and wasn't interested, right? Like this isn't like if I grant everything like that is only God can control nature. How do you know that? You haven't established that,
right? Yeah. You start to get into that sort of thing a lot going on from here, points 3, 4, and 5. It's a lot of just assertions that they expect you to just kind of follow along with.
right?
Because this could just be Satan, right? Like, Satan has power over the world. Also, he could have just been a prophet, like how other religions interpret him, and prophets do miracles. Prophets are given the authority to speak on behalf of God. Prophets fulfill prophecy. Like, you look at it, and also he predicts and accomplishes his own resurrection as if the only explanation is that he said it beforehand and they wrote it down and then he rose from the dead, and not somebody with motivations to say that he made a prophecy. Like, Matt Dillahunty always gets in trouble for saying like claims aren't evidence, but in this case it's kind of relevant, right? The claim of a prophecy when you don't know when the prophecy was made.
Well, I think
makes the whole thing irrelevant.
I think here part of it is they're arguing that Old Testament prophecies were fulfilled by Christ. which is one of those things. There's a big asterisk on that statement. I'll just leave it at that. That's a whole rabbit hole.
Interesting. I like the idea of inserting the same way when like people will be like, well, God created the universe and stuff. Like, what if someone created God? You know, like what if you know, you said Satan? What about like Kevin? Like, what if there's just a guy, right? I'm going to make Jesus, right? It sounds ridiculous and almost insultingly so, but like, I'm kind of joking the truth here, where it's like,
no, that's literally what Gnosticism says.
Interesting.
Gnostic cosmology.
Okay.
Gnostic cosmology are like, well, who made this person? And then you just keep stacking. Supernatural
turtles all the way down.
Pretty much. That's Gnosticism.
And you also have I don't know, it's such a weird point that he claimed, like, you couldn't both claim to be God and be wrong about that and also do these other things, where they kind of just like treat it like an omnibus bill through all of Congress.
Yeah. What if he thought he was God because he had like powers? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
they say lunatic, liar, Lord, but what about mistaken?
Right. Think about Harry Potter if he never found out about Hogwarts. He's like, why can I do these things? Like, totally. You know what I mean? I can be very imaginative and creative and think of a million explanations. And it's interesting how in this document they will like slow down and really, 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 really painfully like kind of parse through a claim and then just whisk us through like 9 of them.
Yep.
Right? And let's stop at this one now. And it's like, wait, what's happened?
You'll notice also that the claims they spend time on are like things where they can actually sort of make an argument, but then the ones that they skip right over, you're like, how would you even begin to establish that only God has power over life and death? Right.
It's like I have an AirPods case here, and it's like if I spent 5 minutes convincing you guys this is an AirPods case, and then I was like, an AirPods cases smell bad, which means I smell bad. And therefore, like, wait, what?
Yeah, exactly. Like,
Or it'd be like you proving that AirPods cases exist. And then you're like, and you're also in the room with me in Colorado with the AirPods case. And you're like, you proved point 1 that AirPods cases existed. And then you skipped over the fact that you're bilocating in an invisible way to my bedroom. Like,
yeah.
You're like,
yeah.
And so this conclusion here, back to the document, conclusion, the Trilemma Revisited. C.S. Lewis's Trilemma remains as relevant as ever. If Jesus claimed to be God, and the evidence shows he did, then he cannot merely be a, quote, good moral teacher, unquote. If he was lying, he was a deceiver. If he was mistaken, he was delusional. If he was telling the truth, he is Lord. Faced with the overwhelming evidence from Scripture and history, we can confidently conclude, and this is all in all bold, Jesus Christ was neither a liar or a lunatic. He was and is the Lord and God of all.
Can you remind me of the overwhelming evidence? Like, if I believe everything they've said so far,
so basically,
what is the overwhelming evidence?
The overwhelming evidence is that people were around when he was around, and they wrote down supposedly what he said, and that we can know that they said that they reported it accurately, and that in the things that they said, he claims that he's God. And he has to be God because like they also claimed that he did magic, and like we like know that they were accurate about like who the governor was when it happened, so that means that they must be accurate about the magic stuff too.
And also they do this like if he was lying, he was a deceiver, and you're like, no, there's like 8 million explanations for lying besides he intentionally did it. Same thing, if he was mistaken, he was delusional, and you're like no. I mean, he could have been. Also 8 million other possibilities around mistaken.
I've been reading a lot of scientific papers recently, and I'm just contrasting that with this, where it's like like there might be someone who wants to just find out like an incredibly like obvious and asinine thing, right? Like, is there a correlation between like watering a plant or not and the plant surviving or not? And they'll be like, we got like 500 genetically identical plants and we watered 250 of them. And then for the other 250, just in case the existence of the watering can and its proximity to the plant could help the plant, instead of just not watering the 250 dry ones, we literally just took a watering can and made pretend to water it just in case that does something, so we can really truly isolate the independent variable of the water. And we saw that all of our plants died that weren't watered. And from that, that supports our inference that perhaps water is important for plants. And then I'm just thinking about that sort of compared to well, these people probably wrote it who said they wrote it, and they probably were there. What are they, liars?
It's really what it gets down to.
It's very interesting to think about this in that lens, and maybe it's kind of obtuse of me to do that, but it's just honestly the lens through which I look at things. And it's just in established, especially because they've kind of adopted these kind of aesthetics of science with the Big Bang stuff, and it's scientists put in so much work to make the tamest conclusions and assertions, and then it's just the amount of just hand waving in this is just it's charming in a way. It's fun.
Yeah.
And also, I love at the very end, he was and is the Lord and God of all. They kind of slip up on words here, that something can be Lord and not God because they have to both say Lord and God, which kind of undermines their point.
They like the alliteration of the Lord, liar, lunatic. So
he also was and is, and it's just
Another thing in science is bias, right? And it's just through that lens as well. It's these aren't people who are the people writing this document aren't hey, I was wondering, do you think God exists? I've never thought about that before. Let's think about it.
And so that's point 3. Did Jesus claim to be God? And so to recap, point 1 in last episode, does God exist? Greg said that they did not set the Jenga blocks down. And then we laid layer 2 of attempted Jenga bricks on, are the Gospels historically reliable, which also wasn't laid down. And then now number 3 on, did Jesus claim to be God, is also just kind of pouring soup on a table, I think is what they've successfully done so far.
My hope for them is in this home stretch, they build a boat that floats on the soup.
Get ready for a lot more parsing of very specific phrases.
Okay.
Colin, do you want to kick off 4 for us?
All right. Did Jesus establish an infallible church? Having established the historical reliability
Wait, is asking, is there anything wrong with the Catholic Church?
Oh, they'll explain what they mean, I think.
Okay.
It is an interesting word. I'm so used to it now, I forget that it's not a word everyone uses all the time for everything. Okay. Having established the historical reliability of Scripture and Jesus' claim to divinity, the next question naturally follows. I don't think it does, but did Jesus establish a church? And if so, is that church still in existence today? Even before diving into Scripture, the necessity of a governing religious authority is in itself strong evidence that Christ must have established one. Without a central authority, Christianity would have fractured from the very beginning, as believers from diverse backgrounds would have disagreed on who Jesus was and what he taught.
Buzz, that sentence, even just that one sentence, you could write 1,000 pages on is there a way that this church would have survived? You know what I mean? It's almost it almost makes this stronger that instead of just one ridiculous thing, it's 30 of them.
Oh yeah.
And it's just this deluge where it's it's too much to unpack.
I love it. Without an infallible guide, who could settle such disputes? Even the devil, after all, can quote Scripture for his own purposes, as Shakespeare reminds us, quote, the devil can cite Scripture for his purpose. Thanks.
Shakespeare.
Thus, if Christ intended to lead his followers after his ascension into heaven, he flew up into heaven at the end of the story, he must have left an authoritative guide to instruct them.
We know the devil's real. When did they establish that in this?
They talk about that in the Gospels. So because literally every word of the Gospels must be true because they got the governor right.
Right, because they were solid guys who wrote those.
Yeah, they're chill, and they also they knew who the governor was at the time, so they're probably accurate about stuff.
Okay.
Anyway, the church foreshadowed in the Old Testament?
Well, let's pause first at
let's see.
What do you make of this argument of Jesus just had to have established a church?
It's the natural next question.
I am starting to feel like, so me and my husband want to have a kid someday. And I hope they're smart, right? And then I feel like there's gonna be some day where the kid's in high school and he wants to convince us to like cut class during finals week to go to Disneyland. What he's gonna do is gonna make a big PowerPoint just like this, where she's like, here is argument 35. Like, now that we've established that school is meaningless, like as this quote by Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs, famous school dropout. Like it's just like it's almost so cute. It's almost cute. It's like okay, I can tell you really put a lot of effort in this, and it's like you can't go to Disneyland. I'm sorry, but like that's how I'm just starting to feel like it's like hey, good try, but it's just like there's just so much. There's just something kind of funny and charming about this whole thing that's just starting to emerge for me. And I'm also starting to feel like this is like a school project. Like, are you guys sure that like this is like a real like okay, yeah, it feels like someone's high school project.
Well,
okay.
I think before we started, I mentioned that this reads exactly like this would have been explained to me in like 5th grade.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, somebody in the comments is going to go, no, you should have looked at this presentation. And then there's just like this played whack-a-mole with Catholic apologetics, where as soon as we whack-a-mole, somebody in the comments is like, well, what about this mole over here? And then we whack that one. Somebody's like, that mole's not represented. It's actually this mole. And then you just kind of like hit a bunch of moles.
You're like functionally a Catholic monk just reading this stuff all day.
Yes, literally.
Which is kind of the point where if God is real, this presentation is proof that God's kind of dumb when it comes to making us follow him, right? Like if you have to do this 27-page giant ass document that doesn't convince somebody from the outside world and relies on huge leaps and logics to get you to this end, is kind of proof that God's hidden. Like he would expect, as somebody who's spent years diving into this, and somebody's gonna be like, oh, you should read this book and you should read that book. And it's like, I've probably already read the book and I don't come to the same conclusion. It's kind of proof that, I don't know, God seems kind of bad at this whole wanting to save his people thing.
One thing that comes to mind, and I have to be vague about this because this is like a recorded thing. I participated in a thing that was filmed it was like a competition thing. And a lot of stuff went wrong. And every time something went wrong, and me or someone in earshot of me was like, why is this happening? We were told, like, oh, it's part of it. This is part of it. Like, this is part of the challenge. This is like, no, you don't get it, guys. Like, even though the cameras aren't rolling, like, this is part of it. And then later, I found out that it was, in fact, not part of it. And like, I feel like when you're describing these things, like, I feel like the kind, I'm just picturing, like, that producer just being like, no, like, the fact that it's confusing and it's hard and, like, it makes it challenging and, like, you have doubt, you get to power it through, that's part of it. Like, that's just kind of I'm just getting deja vu here.
It's very that.
And also, this whole thing, like, from this point onwards, Catholics kind of just go, well, there just has to be somebody in charge, and so they just pick somebody in charge. In this case, like, kind of, if Christ intended to lead his followers after his ascension, he must have left an authoritative guide to instruct them. Is like, it didn't seem like he thought he was going to be long, right? It kind of seemed like he kind of went out to get milk and then never came back, is kind of the vibe at the end of it. It's very that. And so he didn't seem to establish this, nor did he have to establish. And there's 8 other million conceivable options besides he had to find one person to lead this entire thing, and that person lives in Rome.
It's so funny to me because this well, scroll back up just so that we can this sort of first foray into this point 4 of them just saying, well, you need a religious authority so you can, like, mediate doctrinal disputes, essentially. It's like, well, clearly not every Christian thinks that, because there's a whole lot of Protestants out here who don't have that view, because they believe that God can speak to them directly through the Holy Spirit, and he can guide their interpretations through the Holy Spirit. So clearly this doesn't follow, obviously, for many Christians. And so if points 1 and 2 are supposed to speak to atheists and non-Christians respectively,
Right.
points 4 and 5 are where we're supposed to be talking to other Christians and convincing them that that the Catholics are the right ones. And so just being like, well, obviously there needs to be an authority, right? Like, no, not obviously.
Okay, you guys' opinion on something?
Mm-hmm.
So just like your best guess, and it is just a guess, right? Because you can't know, but like, is this intentionally confusing?
No. Well, I don't think they think it is. I think they think it's very simple because the people who wrote this document are probably immersed in Catholicism. And so a lot of these things feel obvious to them.
Mm-hmm.
So no, I don't think it's meant to be intentionally confusing. I think it's, unfortunately for them, the data isn't as clean as they want it to be. And so it just is confusing by nature. And so they have to sort of pretend it isn't.
And is this why they believe? Are they outlining why they believe, or are they backfilling? Are they backfilling? Yes. Like if you asked them privately, like, hey, so why do you believe in this stuff? Would they not be like, well, step 1 is the Big Bang, like, right? Like it feels like they're kind of. It feels, because it just feels so shaky and weird, it almost feels like this is, well, why would someone think this? Not why do we think this? Do you know what I mean?
So there's an example from Matt Fradd, who's a very large Catholic influencer, kind of like the leading podcast voice. And he always gives the analogy like, this stuff is like taking somebody from the parking lot to the beach and like dipping their toes in the water. But at some point, you still have to make the leap of faith to get into the water. So they both think they have good reasons. And they also, like, when you really press them, still admit the relevance of faith.
Right.
And so even this, and also put it this way, where they describe theology, like the study of God and all things in relation to him, as faith-seeking understanding, is how they phrase all of this. Which, if you notice, the first word of that sentence is faith. And then seeking understanding is where they kind of backfill all of this. And also, it's the game of apologetics is relatively new in the Christian world. Like 400 years ago, you wouldn't have such this like weird emphasis on these intricacies of history because we didn't have access to a lot of this data.
You might 400 years ago, you might have 1600s. You got Spinoza and people. You might have.
Is this a response to? Is it the response to the threat of like encroaching like pluralism and secularism? Like what is the motivation for apologetics?
So historically, throughout the church, there's been different like apologists in the sense of promoting church arguments and tearing down anti-church arguments, but generally they take the tenor, like they change in style based on whoever the opposition is. So like in the early periods, you'll have like Against Heresies by Irenaeus, where he's just like essentially being like, oh, all these other belief systems are all these other types of Christians are wrong because XYZ.
Right.
Which you could technically call apologetics. But then like by the time you get to like the modern period, you have certain people like Spinoza who are like, well, maybe God is just sort of like the sum total of the universe, man. And like maybe we don't have like a knowledge of him as a person. And then they have to write, well, actually we do because we can know this and this and that. But then as like secular scholarship of, well, first of all, science, and then second of all, of scripture, what gives us better and better understanding of these things. They have to sort of put up more and more of a fight to keep people with the idea that it's a reasonable belief to hold.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting because when again, I was never like an educated religious person, but when I was, sucked into a youth group in middle school and became like a true believer, it was not like, well, here's my sort of like flow chart. It was this just sort of strong sense of like, this is just true. And I can't explain how it's true, but I just know that it's true. Mm-hmm. And I'm having these sort of, experiences that I can't explain and these feelings and this sense of a presence and like, I'm also getting community and it's going really well for, you know what I mean? And it's like, I just, so this feels like the audience for this is not believers. Well,
the audience, if I were to guess, would say that the audience for this specific document is believers. It's people who already believe for emotional reasons. that the Catholic Church is the church that's true, and are looking for
a permission structure.
Exactly. And possibly have been asked probing questions by people who are not Catholic, who are saying, well, this doesn't make sense to me, or that doesn't make sense to me, and this doesn't feel like a good reason to believe that. And so oftentimes this stuff is like self-soothing. It's, oh, I have doubt, or I have questions, or this feels weird to me. I want to make sure that I don't feel like I'm believing something for no reason.
And you're also coached to say, we have an answer to everything and let me get back to you. Anytime somebody asks you like a question that you can't answer, which is like your Muslim friend at school is like, Jesus was a prophet and didn't claim to be God. And then in your head, you're like, oh shit, I never actually remember the part in the Bible where Jesus claims to be God. And then you go to your pastor, and then your pastor points you to the apologist. Apologetics is also kind of this like extra credit type of vibe, where it's two things. One, if you're really into your faith, you do the extra credit. And also, if the kid in your youth group is asking questions you don't know how to answer, you throw books at him to bog him down. Because like Colin and I've said, like we've looked at this stuff for years, and so it's kind of easier to parse through a lot of this because we've done this for years. But for your average Christian who like wants to come to these conclusions, they kind of just accept an answer and squint hard enough. I remember my friend who converted to Catholicism, I was talking to him, and he's like, and every time I had a question, my priest had an answer. And I was like, but was it a good answer? Where like having an answer in a courtroom doesn't mean you're right. What you need is a good argument. But when you're motivated to maintain the beliefs, you kind of go, oh yeah, Jesus claimed I am, so he claimed to be God. And without a motivation, it's kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of more complicated than that. But if you have a motivation, it's like, it's really clear.
Interesting.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, it reminds me. So I've done, since I was a teenager, I've done volunteer work at different like scientific nonprofits. And I'd field questions from the public a lot that I didn't have the answer to. And you could go to there's like an email you could write to where they would the person who manages that account would like forward your question to like the relevant like scientist on staff to get like an answer. And that almost reminds me of this, where it's like, it seems like the average person wouldn't read, all, 5,000 pamphlets on everything. But it's like, if you start to have doubt, it's like you ask the person who's familiar with this stuff and then they get back. Is that accurate?
There's literally an organization called Catholic Answers. That's literally their whole gig, is that they have a call-in show and you just call in and they will answer. They have like the Catholic Encyclopedia or the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Like there's all these like resources that, especially in what's called the New Evangelization movement, which is sort of the modern Catholic apologetics push. There's a lot of resources.
It does cool graphic design like this and has answers. It's
the graphic design, that's the graphic design on this is lovely. So what was your guys' relationship with this? Like, did you, at a certain point, I'm assuming that, you're learning about it and it's exciting. And then I'm imagining there's a moment when you're kind of losing your faith. And I know that losing your faith, there's a lot of, there's like deconversion, and then like there's, leaving deconstruction and all those, right? I'm loose umbrella term there. Was there a point where like these became horrifying because you realized they didn't make sense after you turned to them for comfort?
Yeah. So I, in ninth grade, I wasn't particularly religious, and then hit these arguments, and you get sucked in. Like I said, having an answer feels compelling. And so you're both like, you're asking questions, and then you're just taking the entire question or the answer like wholesale and not having the tools to investigate the relevancy of the answer. But you get mesmerized by the fact, like growing up, faith is like this amorphous thing. And then somebody kind of whispers to you in the back room, like, we have reasons for what we believe. And then you're like, oh crap, we have reasons for what we believe, because they're like, premise 1, blank, premise 2, blank. And then you get like wrapped into like memorizing everything. And then I say, like, after then I learned everything, like I read all of the books, and then you kind of like have an answer to everything. And I used to, in my youth group, just like field questions all day long from people where they just ask any question. And even to this point, I could do the Catholic answer to any conceivable question. But like once I fully had the map like rendered, and then you start getting to like play around and connecting dots between the different things, where once you know the points, you can kind of like play the points against each other. And then you realize Do you guys know the game Icebreaker?
No.
It's kind of like this 4x4 grid. It's kind of like a foot by a foot. And then they have all these like plastic little ice pieces that are all like smushed in there, and so it's a flat top because of the surface tension. And then you start taking a hammer and like hitting them. It's kind of like horizontal Jenga.
Okay, I get it.
And so you kind of like, except in this game, as soon as the church, as they're talking about here, because the church is infallible, which means it can't err. As soon as you realize the church is erred on one thing, the entire Jenga,
yeah, that's interesting. So is that what infallible means? Does it mean what I think it means?
Well, I think they're going to get to that here, possibly. We should probably we skipped a section where they talk about biblical foreshadowing of the need for a church.
And then really quick, Colin, did you have a similar thing as Cade with like your relationship with this changed over time with these kind of, logic flowcharts?
I was different from Cade in that I grew up immersed in this. He came to it like in high school. I was kind of leaving it by the end of high school. I often talk about like having this tension with people like with Cade who were not converts literally, but like revert is the term, where like you weren't devout growing up and then you sort of became devout later. I never got to make that choice for myself. It was just kind of forced onto me. So for me, a lot of this, I used to talk about this kind of style of apologetic stuff often felt like a logic maze that I was trapped in, where I didn't have the tools to know where the holes were that I could get out of it.
Yeah, you're smart. I remember I was a smart kid, and I was smart enough to understand a lot of sort of adult arguments, but not smart enough to critique them. And so it felt like I was becoming this kind of learned, wise person, but I didn't know what I didn't know, and I didn't realize that I wasn't equipped to like, pick things apart. I was like, oh, that makes sense, and I just kind of memorized the thing and not realize what I was doing.
I had a lot of like sort of classical dilemmas come up for me, like the problem of evil and like original sin and like a lot of these like sort of classic issues people have with the doctrines like occurred to me naturally, and they were always answers. Like Kate said, they always have answers. It's just that sometimes the answers just wouldn't intuitively feel satisfying, but I just didn't have the tools to be like, well, why is this not satisfying? What is going on?
Weird. Yeah.
It's very much like Colin and I have talked about when you're a younger conservative person, you're hearing these arguments like, well, actually, if we lower tax rates, actually the economy grows and expands. And so, like, you have a smaller slice of the pie, but the pie is bigger. Is like the conservative argument on taxation, which, like, is an answer. And, like, it makes sense, right? Like, if we cut taxes, economy grows. And then it's not until a few years later when you investigate that without already listening to Ben Shapiro all day, and you're like, wait, actually, the pie doesn't grow. And we know every single time they've tried this, that doesn't happen. Or any of these arguments where or even Colin and I've talked about this too. Like, I remember listening to Ben Shapiro when I was younger, and he's like, well, we need to not have social stability programs because actually we know that according to UCLA, the in FDR's recovery plan actually extended the Great Depression by 8 years. And then you kind of just like take it, and then later on you're like, oh, I should like find that study, and then you Google the study, and then you realize the study doesn't exist that like the whole argument's based off of. And so a lot of this stuff is kind of like you get the answer, but inside of your Catholic parish you'll never have pushback on the answer, so the answer just stands. Or even on the idea of like, did Jesus claim to be God? Like, it's not until you leave the faith and you're like, wait, the Trinity is kind of like a later invention, and the idea of monotheism is also itself a later invention. And also, even if you grant those two premises, the Son of Man or I Am are actually names that are ascribed to other people. It's like, you don't ever get that pushback, and so you just assume.
I'm imagining like a kid who thinks that Santa comes down the chimney every year, and then like he realizes one day that they have an electronic fireplace and there's like no chimney, and like, wait, what? I never poked my head in there and looked.
Well, then they have to reply to the answer, like with Santa Claus. Then when my brothers and I were getting a little bit older, then my parents got a Santa key, which is for people with an electric fireplace. You put this like large key on your front door, and that gives Santa access.
Right.
Can go in the front door. And so this is the example in Apologetics where like you just assert it, and then you kind of have like a reply, and then you have a reply to the reply. But then you realize
it's all charted out.
Yeah, and then you realize it's kind of like a castle in the clouds. You're like, but the problems of Santa still exist regardless if we give him a key to the house. But also the key to the house doesn't fit the lock. And also the whole idea of Santa going to every house doesn't make intuitive sense. But then they're like, well, Santa only comes if you believe that he comes. So like, shut up about the fact that you think Santa doesn't exist because it's going to make your case worse. Is kind of like the deal here.
All right.
Do you want to try to continue with point 4, see if we can get you to believe that there was an infallible church established?
Yeah, so we're kind of skipping over the church foreshadowed in the Old Testament because, I don't know, I feel like Jewish people would be the expert on Jewish thought, not Catholics. Yeah. So any of this like old typology is wacky. But we get into Jesus established his church. Jesus came to perfect and fulfill the authority of the Old Covenant in his own kingdom. Throughout his ministry, he declared the arrival of the kingdom, quote, "But if it is by the finger of God that I cast out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you," unquote. Yet knowing that he would ascend into heaven, he appointed a head steward to govern in his absence. This was foreshadowed in the Old Testament. It talks about the Davidic kingdom. I'm going to skip that quote. Jesus fulfills this passage in his appointment to Peter. Quote, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven," unquote. By giving Peter the keys, Jesus was establishing him as the chief steward over his kingdom on earth, the church. St. Paul explicitly describes the church as a spiritual household built upon Christ with the apostles as its foundation. Quote, "So then you are no longer strangers and sojourners, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the house of God, built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone," unquote. Thus, Jesus founded a visible hierarchical church governed by the apostles under Peter's leadership. Boom. End case. Yeah.
I want to know if there, like the anatomy of the finger of God. I've also heard the hand of God. Mm-hmm. Is there a correlation between the size of the body part and like the effort, right? So if I use my finger to do something, I'm kind of like, yeah, you know, like is there ever like the fist of God? Like that is completely irrelevant to the point they're making. But I was wondering, like,
I have a great book for you that you would find fascinating, called God and Anatomy, where this is biblical scholar. She goes through all of like biblical and extra biblical writings and just traces like conceptions of God's body parts through different
I would love to know like what parts of God are canon, right? Because you know there's the hand in what's it called? What's that Addams Family? The hand that is crawled around?
I think it's called what's it called? Thank you.
Is that God? Right? Because there's the hand, and the hand contains the finger.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the weird thing about the idea. Nowadays, it's like, oh, God's all powerful and the first mover. And then, like, the book of Genesis, he's like talking to a crowd of other gods, and then he comes down and walks physically in a garden. And then he also like wrestles with people throughout the Old Testament. And so you're like, so God's just, he more or less comes off like one of the Greek gods kind of in the Old Testament. But then you gotta like, well, he only like spiritually walked through the garden. And then the Mormons believe that
it's Jesus. It was all Jesus. That's the answer, is what they give. It's it was Jesus doing all of that, which is a great way to...
It's so weird because the quote is always, "The Bible, when properly understood, cannot be an error." And then you're like, what the fuck does the Bible say? Because it seems like a contradicting bowl of soup. But then you get into these books, and there are an infinite rabbit hole of books to make all of these things play in harmony, where like the parts where God's wrestling gets his hip popped out while wrestling is different than him in the garden. And then you're like, and then Melchizedek, and then you're like, Melchizedek's kind of like this like weird alien. It's like, it's never ending rabbit hole.
That's such an interesting premise to start from, that if properly understood, that's such an interesting caveat, because then it's guaranteed to make sense, because you are required to interpret it in a way that makes it make sense.
Yep.
So like the most obvious, counterpoint to my joke about, is God just the hand from the Addams Family? Is like, well, no, like the hand of God is like, they mean that figuratively, right? It's like, you could make anything make sense if your starting proposition is the only correct way to interpret this is in the way that it makes sense.
Yep.
Right? Like if you
For
told
example, I was going to say, for example, this thing about I'm giving Peter keys and you're a rock. It's like, what is that? Like, A, what does that mean? B, we've like excused bigger things in the Bible as being spiritual, and giving somebody the keys. They're like, and Peter got the keys. Ergo, we're going to have these like universal rules about beaver meat on Fridays. It's like,
Right.
we went from these weird allegories to like, and therefore don't be gay. And you're like, damn, that seems like every one of these steps has like 20 more steps inside of it. It's like the endless rushing nesting doll rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Why don't we keep going?
Yeah.
Because I think they've just tried to say that Christ founded an existing church that has a hierarchy and it's under Peter, which maybe.
Do you want to read this one, Colin?
Yeah. The church's succession. But is the same church still in existence today? Jesus promised that his church would never fail. Quote, the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. Unquote. If Christ's church had fallen into error or had ceased to exist, then his promise would have failed. But history shows an unbroken line of succession from Peter to the present day. The earliest record of this succession comes from St. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century. Quote, the blessed apostles, having founded and built up the church, committed into the hands of Linus the office of the episcopate. Of this Linus, Paul makes mention in the epistles to Timothy. To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him, in the 3rd place from the apostles, Clement was allotted the bishopric. From Peter to Linus, then Anacletus, then Clement, we can trace a continuous line of successors leading to the present pope. Not only has Peter's lineage been preserved, but so too has his authoritative role, as seen in early church writings. St. Clement of Rome, writing in 80 AD, commands the faithful to obey the authority of the church. Quote, accept our counsel, and you will have nothing to regret. If anyone disobeys the things which have been said by him, Jesus, through us, let them know that they will involve themselves in no small danger. St. Ignatius of Antioch, writing around 110 AD, acknowledges Rome's unique authority. Quote, you have envied no one, but others have you taught. And St. Irenaeus in 180 AD declares that all Christians must remain in communion with the Church of Rome. Quote, for it is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church on account of its preeminent authority. Unquote.
Interesting. I feel like it's kind of like the Church of Theseus. Like, is it still the same church?
Very
Even
much.
though, yeah, it's interesting, perhaps, and very like there's so many like Cade said, it's like everything is like a Russian nesting doll where it's like I could take any sentence. I'd say more sentences in that thing you just read than not. I could be like, let's just dissect that for half an hour and like.
Hopefully. Yeah, know that every single one of these claims is contested.
Yeah, and again, it's like they've lost me at this point. Like I don't even understand what this proves if it's true.
What they're trying to prove is if the Gospels are accurate, then we have this line where Jesus says that Peter, you're in charge of the apostles, and the hell will not be able to prevail against what you're establishing, and he has a successor, and that his people used to listen to the successor. That's what they're trying to prove.
Has anyone ever proposed to these people, like, what if, like, before everyone could read, like, obviously everyone still can't read, but you know what I mean? Not everyone can read, but what if, like, a bunch of people got together? What if all this was true, and then a bunch of people got together and, like, let's just add, like, 6 or 7 sentences to this thing?
We know they did that. We have literal proof that happened multiple times.
Right, and that's the thing where it's like, it's just like, it's like, well, these guys, like if you could get in a time machine and read the Gospels, you know, when they were written, like they'd be true. And like, okay, but like it's been a long time. Like,
yeah,
you know what I mean? It's just there's kind of a lack of imagination, I feel, in the minds of the authors of this guide.
I agree. We might as well just keep going because, like you said, like you could dive into any single one of these, but it's also dense, and you're just kind of like, really, dude? Like, you're not even.
Yeah, so like all of these claims are so heavily contested that once again, like we talked at the beginning of all of this, like we started with this idea that like we can bring you from A to Z in like a Jenga tower type of way. And then now every single brick has somewhat crumbled. And all that we have to do in the logic train is like pop out one of the Jenga blocks because they all go. And so in every single field, you as a Catholic, to say that you can prove your faith, have to overrule a majority of scholars on every single point ever.
Yep.
without exception, is an astronomical conclusion. Yeah, so back into this document here. The name Catholic. Some object at the word Catholic is not found in Scripture. However, the term was used as early as 110 AD, which, side note, is Jesus was maybe 30 AD, by St. Ignatius of Antioch. Quote, wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church, unquote. The Greek word, whatever that is, means, or Catholicos, means universal, or according to the whole. From the beginning, the Church was known as Catholic, because it is open to all people, in all places, for all times. Conclusion. From Scripture, history, and reason, we see that 1. Jesus established a visible church to preserve unity in faith and morals. 2. This church was built on Peter and the apostles with authority to govern. 3. Christ promised that the church would never fail. 4. History traces the church's leadership directly to the Catholic Church today. Thus, the Catholic Church is the very church that Jesus Christ founded, the kingdom of heaven on earth. Quote, the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth, unquote.
I like the way they're kind of like implicitly like naturalizing the like definition of the word Catholic, where it's like, well, Catholic like means this, so, like why would it be called that if it wasn't that? It's like if I came out with like a really gross like candy and I called it like yummy candy, it's like, well, yummy means tasty, and it's like, yeah, but like you named it that.
Or it'd be like a lot of banks are named like the first bank of wherever, and you're like, yeah, it's in the title, it's the first bank, and you're like,
or like when you see somewhere that has like 2 stars on Yelp and it's like world famous hamburgers, and
it's the
like,
scene in Elf where he's like, it's the world's best coffee, which goes that random diary. She's like, oh. Yeah, I mean, it's like hard to know what to do with. It's like, okay, yeah, sure. I agree that because it's called the Catholic Church and the word Catholic isn't in the Bible. Like, okay, that isn't a good objection. I agree, but I still don't think that they haven't proved what point 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these of these things. So it's kind of like, I don't know what to do with this, man.
And there's even like
they also didn't even discuss infallibility. I thought they would.
Yeah, no, they just kind of like, all of the big assumptions are like baked into these mundane assumptions, right? On the idea of, are the Gospels historically reliable? They bury the point that they are without error and are exact replicas of the very words that happened, down to the very word and letter. It's like, that's a different claim than like the Gospels were written around a time frame about something. And same thing here. Yeah.
Do they grant that the people who wrote the Gospels were people and not like, okay, yeah. And that's the one thing where it's like, think about, I think you can draw a direct comparison to the standards we hold eyewitness testimony contemporarily, right? Like if I tried to tell you a story from like 10 years ago, I wouldn't be great at it. And it's interesting to me how much work that does, the kind of eyewitness thing where it's like, you could directly analogize that to like very, very easy to imagine examples. Like, hey, like write a book about your high school experience. It's like, how would you do that like perfectly, right? Well, and then entrust people to do a game of telephone with that for 2,000 years or whatever it is, right?
Yep.
And that'd be like you and your high school friends 6 years later are trying to decide who was correct. And instead of being like, maybe we might have remembered this differently, you're like, Joe over there, like somebody has to have remembered this perfectly, and Joe's that person. And you're like, or you could just be wrong. In the same way, like Mormons have this idea where after the death of the last apostle, like church authority got stamped out until then the restoration of the gospel. And there's also Catholic, like you talk about the schism between the East and the West, and like 1000 was like, well, this other branch broke off and like who has the authority? And then you talk about sedevacantists that are like in the 1900s, the church apostatized because it taught heresy. Like every generation has said somebody in each generation has said that the authority ends here. And so not only was it not established, it's also seemed to have been abrogated at all times and all places by all of these different things. And
do they cover that in the guide? Do they? Because like the way that they talk about it, to my memory and understanding, is they almost talk about it like the Gospels were like put into like a time capsule and then unsealed like last week, right? Like, they don't acknowledge that we don't have like the original written document.
They'll
You know what I
acknowledge
mean?
that we don't literally have it, but they'll try to claim that we can basically know exactly what it said, which is just not true.
Right.
Yeah. And then we'll speed run point 5, which is that church the present day Catholic Church? Also, I don't like how they set up the questions just from a workflow standpoint. Like 4 and 5 don't need to be separated. Like point 1 needs more work, like a lot more work. In points 4 and 5 need to be condensed. But it continues. Faith is at the heart of the Christian life. But what is faith? And how does it relate to the question of which church Christ founded? At the beginning of his autobiography, G.K. Chesterton humorously points out that much of what we claim to know in life actually rests on the faith of others. He writes, quote, bowing down in blind credulity, as is my custom, before mere authority and the tradition of the elders, superstitiously swallowing a story I could not test at the time by experiment or private judgment, I am firmly of the opinion that I was born on the 29th of May, 1874, unquote. None of us remember our own birth. We believe that our birthday, not because we have seen it for ourselves, but because of the testimony of others. This illustrates a fundamental truth. Faith is based on trust in a messenger. But if faith in natural things, such as historical events, science, and even our own birthday, depend on credible witnesses, then the faith in supernatural things must rely on an even greater witness, one whose authority is divine. This brings us to the question, if God has revealed himself to mankind, then where do we hear his voice today?
Thoughts?
Interesting. Well, what is the answer to where we hear his voice today?
Catholicism.
The Catholic Church.
It's the church. I don't know. I this whole point, this like, oh, you don't even know your birthday because you trust people. It's like,
well, there's
you have a birth certificate. You look at that.
If you told me there was like someone wrote down someone's birthday, how long ago was Jesus? How long ago was this?
2000 or so.
Yeah, 2,000 years ago, someone wrote this down, and then it was this giant game of telephone where basically everyone in the telephone chain had a very, very strong motivation to mess with the information. Then it would be a more apt analogy. Like it's like you can get your birth certificate. They wrote it down. And you can talk to the people who were there.
And you can also investigate yourself. Like if you were to prove your birthday, you could do a genetic test to get a general range, right? You could look at a number of different factors to get a rough age range. It might not tell you between 30 or 31, but it's going to give you a general idea. You could figure out when your first documentation came online, right? With Jesus, you have to go, like we have accounts of him 100, 200, 300 years later, but with myself, I could just ask 40 people in my family when they would guess it. I could look at my birth certificate. I could look at hospital records from that time.
There's also there's also what they're asking you to believe. If they're asking you to believe, like, you were born March 3rd, 2002, right? It's like, that's like that. I think that you don't need as strong evidence for that claim as you need for like all these miracles happened. Right. And that's the other thing where it's conflating how extraordinary the claims are, in addition to ignoring the fact that you can't go and talk to the people who wrote the Gospels.
And I also call this epistemological quicksand, where most Christian apologists love to pounce on this idea of like, how do you know anything? And then when you're like, can you prove beyond any conceivable doubt the exact second that you were born? And you're kind of like, I feel like we can have a reasonable degree of certainty in accordance to the reasonableness of the claim. But they just like get people to question, and then halfway through they're like, here's a life draft, and that life draft is these wild supernatural claims. Yeah. Right, to your point, if the conditions of my birth are reasonable, right? I was born on this particular day in this particular year, and I seem to be about that age, and it matches up. It would be cool. But then I would have less certainty if you're from some cult family that doesn't keep records and you never had a social security, and your mom says this day, your dad says this day. You kind of like, oh, like maybe I can't know then. And then also, if I was claimed to be 140 years old and I have a birth certificate, you would not trust the birth certificate. But if the birth certificate's around an expected age, you wouldn't press the birth certificate. So like, it's the old phrase that I love when Christians get like worked up in arms about the idea that like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Well, they're doing a version of that right here. It says faith is based on trust in a messenger. If faith in natural things is based on credible witnesses, then faith in supernatural things requires an even greater witness. They're trying to take the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence and like shift it over to be like, well, we just have to trust in a really great messenger, and that's how we'll know.
The other thing too is like you can test many claims, right? And not even necessarily in a scientific context. Like if I tell you that ice makes a drink cold, you can try it, right? If I tell you that somebody's a nice person, you can meet them and see for yourself. And so there's no way to like find out for yourself if these biblical claims are true. You can't get in the time machine and go look.
And also when you look at these witnesses throughout the centuries, to your example of telephone, Catholics would be like, look at they all believed a common thing, and then you realize they only believed like 1 out of 100 things, and 99 out of the other things have been contested in some form. And they'll be like, this person in the 3rd century thought the same as the 12th century, and then you're like, but they didn't agree on everything. There's like one commonality, and they'll be like, somebody in the 12th century believed the same as the 15th century, except it's not the same claim. It's like this claim, and then you're like, so it's kind of like telephone, and or it'd be like us showing up to use the crime example in court with like 8 people that are motivated to say that something didn't happen. And then you're like, see, they all agreed that whatever this happens, they live in the state of New York. And you're like, yeah, they agreed on New York, but the fact of them agreeing on one fact doesn't mean that they didn't do, or they actually did do the thing when there's a motivation there. And so especially on like the gospel accounts or throughout Catholic history, they just kind of assert that the church can't err. And then you read the documents and you're like, it's changed like a lot about all of these different things. And so they also kind of rely on this like hand waving, like to your earlier point, they haven't talked about infallibility yet. They're kind of about to move into, but Colin, do you want to read this next?
Yeah. One more quick point. Also, my cat is getting into the cat food. One sec. Excuse me. Bye-bye. To the point about, well, you can't really know anything. It's like,
so believe anything.
Well, sure, but there's degrees of confidence, right?
Yep.
Like, you don't know how much money is in my bank account, right? Like, you have no idea. Do I know that the sun's going to come up tomorrow? I don't 100% know that, but I'm close enough to 100% that I can just round up, right? And that is where it's like the fact that you can't have 100% certainty doesn't change the fact that you can have any number between 0 and 99.9 repeating. And so the idea that's like, well, you can't have 100%, you can't 100% know things, or like you can kind of functionally know something. And it's interesting that that claim ignores that fact.
Yep. It's there's an example of this fraudster who walked into a random Wells Fargo branch with a $2 billion check from Bill Gates.
Right.
And if he was pushed on it, and then you're like, how do you know this came from Bill Gates? And he's like, well, how do you know any check came from anybody?
Right.
Like, you go to cash a check for $100 from somebody, and does the bank know 100% for sure that this isn't fraud? The answer is like, no, like they don't 100% know, but if this person has a history of checking, they haven't reported any sort of fraud of their checkbook, and then maybe even you call the person and like, yeah, on the other side of the line, could the other person be faking the other person's voice for a $100 check? Like, sure. But that's also, you can't apply that sort of like, we can't absolutely know to the guy who walks into the branch with the $2 billion check from Bill Gates' personal thing. It's like, that's a crazy claim. And exactly. So, yes, so our confidence interval is going to be much lower. But if you're on natural versus supernatural faith, a game of special pleading.
Yep. The Bible defines faith as follows, quote, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen," unquote. Faith, whether natural or supernatural, requires both a message and a messenger. The message provides the content of belief, and the messenger provides the authority to believe it. Natural faith. In daily life, we believe countless things that we have never personally verified. We believe in historical events, such as Julius Caesar's existence, because of historical records. We believe in medical science because of doctors' testimony. We believe in the laws of physics because of the finding of experts. Okay.
That's not what we believe in medical science.
I think their point is you, the individual person, have not conducted medical experiments to verify that everything.
Okay.
I think that's his point. This is natural faith, a faith based on human authority. We trust our parents, teachers, and scientists because of their credibility. However, since human beings can err, natural faith is always subject to doubt.
Let's read through supernatural faith as well, yeah. Just to contrast the two.
But what about faith in God? St. Paul writes, quote, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God," unquote. Unlike natural faith, supernatural faith is a divine gift. It is not merely intellectual assent, but a supernatural grace that enables us to believe what we cannot see, not because of human testimony, but because of God himself. This leads to a crucial question. How does God communicate his message to us today? If faith depends on trust in a messenger, and if faith in God requires hearing God himself, then where does his voice speak?
God, yawn.
Very excited for them to answer their question.
All right, let's just keep going then.
Yeah.
Where does God speak? For faith to be in God, two things must be true. God himself must be the messenger. We cannot simply have faith in what others say about him. We must hear him speak. 2, we must know for certain that it is God speaking. Otherwise, our faith would not be in God, but in human opinion. St. John Henry Newman explains the difference. Quote, "Consider, are not these two states of mind quite distinct from each other? To believe simply what a living authority tells you, and to take a book, such as Scripture, and to interpret it for yourself? In the former you submit, in the latter you judge." Unquote. Faith in a book alone, such as the Bible, is not enough. Books require interpretation. If we rely on our own interpretation, then our faith is ultimately faith in ourselves, not in God. Thus, if God has truly revealed himself, then he must have instituted a living authority to teach with his own voice. Are you convinced so far?
I'm waiting for them to explain this. This is the most honest thing so far, where it's like, well, like, how do we have to know it's really God? And it's like, okay, I'm excited to hear your test.
All right, God's messenger, the Catholic Church. God could have chosen to reveal himself to each person immediately through direct enlightenment, or mediately through an established messenger. Clearly, the fact that the whole world is filled with conflicting opinions about God rules out the first option. This means that God must have revealed himself through an appointed voice. If God speaks, his words must be infallible, for God cannot lie or err.
Well, how do we know that? Why can't he lie?
Yeah, citation. Trust me, bro.
I'm assuming they're saying that God told them that, right?
Which is funny
because the gospel is the word of God. But what if God just lied in the gospel?
Which is very funny because in the Bible, God lies multiple times. There's literally a point in the Old Testament where there's like a prophet has a vision of heaven, and God's like, who will like do my work? And the spirit comes up and says, I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of your prophets that will give them lies, so that they will murder someone. And God's like, yes, go do it, go lie to them.
And God also lets people have the wrong understanding for hundreds and thousands of years about things. Like, God also doesn't correct people when they think wrongly.
Well, that's what the church is for, Kate. Anyway, now, where do we find an infallible voice today? There is only one institution on earth that even claims to teach infallibly regarding faith and morals: the Catholic Church. Quote, "The Roman pontiff, when he speaks ex cathedra, defines the doctrine of faith or morals to be held by the universal church through the divine assistance promised him in Blessed Peter, operates with that infallibility with which the divine Redeemer wished that his church be instructed." Unquote. Thus, the Catholic Church does not claim to be merely one Christian group among many. It claims to be the very voice of God on earth. But how do we recognize it?
Before we go to the recognition, because it goes even further downhill.
Oh, yeah.
Let's stop at just this idea of faith is just trust, have two different types of trust. In a weird way, the bigger the claim, the more different set of epistemological standards you have to apply to it, in some like inversion of how we do reason.
Yeah, you gotta really be able to trust this guy. You gotta really know that it's God if you're gonna trust him.
So let's have less evidence, right? Like, and this is what I can never get out of apologists is, do you have faith or do you know? Right? Like when you need to talk to somebody about like ATP in cells, you're not like, well, I have faith in this idea of like this thing that happened. You just assert it. And there's this book that I'm reading on making God real, which basically shows through large language models that people talk about religious beliefs differently than they do about everyday objects. And to your earlier point, Greg, it's never clear what faith is when you talk to these apologists, because they'll like walk you through every step. And right, this document purports to bring you logically through all of the steps. And then like, so can you prove it, or do you need faith? Like when you do a thesis defense, you're not like, well, if you squint hard enough, man, my thesis is right.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very, I'm waiting. They're like, well, clearly, like we are the only ones who claim to be the voice. You know what I mean? But it's like, what if God told the voice of God not to claim to be the voice of God? But like, there's so many. Yeah. There's a lot of hypotheticals here that I'm just waiting. I'm waiting for them to land the plane.
Well, they're going to prove the next thing we got is evidence. They're going to give us evidence of why they're the voice of God.
To crash land.
You're going to love this part.
Can I read this section, Colin?
You can read the section, Kate.
The church teaches that it bears clear signs of divine origin. Quote, God, through his only begotten Son, has instituted the church and provided it with clear signs of his institution, so they can be recognized by all as the guardian and teacher of the revealed world, unquote. What are these clear signs? The church identifies them as 1, its miraculous spread across the world. 2, its exceptional holiness. 3, its inexhaustible fruitfulness and good works. 4, its unity throughout history. And 5, its invincible stability. Quote, even the church itself, because of its marvelous propagation, its exceptional holiness, and inexhaustible fruitfulness and good works, because of its Catholic unity and invincible stability, is a very great and perpetual motive of credibility, and an incontestable witness of its own divine mission, unquote. Yes.
Why don't we pause on this? Here it is. They've given you the evidence. This is what you wanted. What do you think?
Okay.
Point 1. What do you make of that?
I mean, a lot of things have spread around the world that aren't good. You know, fascism, Coca-Cola, COVID-19. like something spreading is not always good.
One thing
is also Islam's goes like this, has an almost more rapid acceleration. Christianity kind of grows and then 325, and then Islam just goes like this.
Yeah, there's other religions. Like that's the elephant in this room.
Yep.
Islam
is bigger than Catholicism. It's not bigger than Christianity.
Yeah, it doesn't engage with that. We are in this hypothetical vacuum where this is the only religion.
Okay, but
that has done these things.
But it's so holy, though.
Yeah, what is that?
It's exceptional holiness.
As somebody who's outside of the Catholic Church, I hate to break it to you guys watching who are in the Catholic Church. A lot of people crack jokes about Catholicism that are not predicated on its exceptional holiness.
That's just anti-Catholic. That's just anti-Catholic propaganda. You've just been hoodwinked by.
Yeah, I think number 2. Its exceptional holiness is kind of that's a point for people who are already on the team. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
That's not for me.
And so much of this relies on when you're Catholic and you only read Catholic books, and Catholicism is like pumped up, and then you never read a critical approach to anything.
Right.
Like the Christianity is like it spread really fast, and then you kind of look at the growth chart, and you're like, no, and then it piggybacks off of Rome, and then kind of like it's like meh, and then it piggybacks off of more worldly empires in the Middle Ages, and then once the worldly empires, then it kind of like implodes and does the opposite. Right. If you look at and so it's kind of like this weird like up and down implosion graph. So same thing with exceptional holiness. Like if you're Catholic and this is the other like not catch-22, but they'll say like anything holy that the church does is because of holiness, and anything somebody who purports to be Catholic does that's wrong, it's because of Satan.
Right. So bad apples.
Yeah, it's bad apples. And so you can't actually say the church ever did anything wrong. So yes, with exceptional holiness, if you presuppose that any time the bad things happened, it's because of incongruity with God, then you've just defined...
It's no true Scotsman.
Yeah, they are the Scottish immigration authorities on every sin ever.
Yeah.
Okay, but it's been
it's-
so united. It's always been so united. That's why there's never been any divisions.
Yeah,
That's why-
except for the time.
Except for all the times.
These are funny because if they're true, it's still a stupid argument, and then
Yes.
also like none of them are true.
I know.
Like you use the word miraculous. It's miraculous spread. Like, are people just completely like confused about? Like, are there no theories about how Catholicism has spread? It was just miraculous.
They really believe that it is. They really do think that it's a miraculous thing. Which is so weird to me because nothing about it is hard to explain.
And also, it didn't like mutate and go to South America in the 300. Well, talk to the Mormons about that one, but like it's not like the idea of Christianity like hit another continent and then just organically grew. Like historically, it's grown on other continents because of force by these colonial powers. Like, yeah, maybe if this idea, you like put one person on all of the inhabited continents, and by the end of the week, everybody was that religion, I'd be like, damn, that's actually like kind of crazy.
Yeah.
In this case, it was like slaughtering people in South America until they converted. And then in Rome, it was like, hey, you know the time I hated Christians? Actually, we have this really cool road system, and it turns out that Christianity really spread where we had this road system. And then you're like, and in Asia, screw Asia, we don't need Asia. It turns out, like, we don't... It's just like, oh, yeah, we don't care about that one. It's kind of like saying the miraculous spread of Trump is proof that he's God, and then you look at like every other country and you're like, no, like he's not well loved in Zimbabwe or Shanghai. Like,
right. Yeah. I mean, this feels like, you know, in a cartoon when they shoot a gun and then just a little flag comes out that says "pow."
Yep.
Like that's.
They've been building.
That is the point that we are at, in this document.
And so inexhaustible fruitfulness in good works isn't true. Like, or somebody on my Discord asked us the other week, or no, Patreon, was like, hey, guys that were traditional Catholics, do you remember your churches having soup kitchens? Nope. The answer is like, the only people that do the good works are the liberal Catholics that are okay with the evil sins. Those are the ones who focus on the homeless. And then the Catholics that take the faith seriously are just like, put all of our eggs in the hating gay people basket.
Don't forget abortion.
Also, you can see, like, for example, like corporate charity, for example, where it's like, you know, a horrible corporation will have inexhaustible fruitfulness in good works. Because it's like, if we invest, 30 million into our charity arm, that, moves public opinion up this many points. And if we were to try to do that with direct, like if we cut the cost of our products 10%, that would cost us billions of dollars and, get us this much favorability. But if we just make a commercial where we pay for someone's groceries, the groceries were $87 and we got, you know what I mean? There are reasons for people to do good things that are not because they are good.
And on its unity throughout history is laughably absurd. Like the idea of unity, there are times in the church in which the vast majority of people have been heretics.
By their own admission,
by their own admission. Catholics will talk about this. Like, this isn't us, doing, Trinitarian... Yeah, the Arian crisis is, unity. And then also, I'd put it this way. If you took the leading saint from every century in church history, all of them would be condemned by modern standards.
Right.
And if you put a modern Catholic in every decade of Catholicism prior, they'd also be heretics. And so the unity, even a great thinker like Thomas Aquinas is a heretic by modern standards because they're like, oh, remember the time where Mary was conceived without sin? Yeah, you don't, but it happened. It's kind of like so even these great thinkers didn't think that. And then invincible stability is also even more laughably absurd because with the unity you can kind of squint and you can draw these lines that look like S's through theological beliefs, but invincible stability.
Right. I mean, if this were all true, if all of this were true, these 5 claims, it would just be in support of the argument that the Catholic Church is really cool and interesting and good.
Right.
Right. But that doesn't prove that it's like the voice of God. Like that's I'm sure a lot of Taylor Swift fans would say this about the Swifties, right? We've spread miraculously.
Yes.
We're inexhaustible in our giving each other friendship bracelets. We have unity over the course of Taylor's career. Like you could just, this is like a thing that a person is a really big fan of, right? Fully. This is not supernatural.
Yep. And once again, all of these arguments are trying to be stacked on the idea that, like, ergo, we have very specific rules around what you can and can't do with your partner, like in the privacy of your bedroom. Yep. Right? It's like the church grew fast. It's like those memes where it's like a YouTube video, and then it's like, and I fast forwarded 10 seconds and it's just a different scene and like a very chaotic scene. Right. It's like this where you start and then you tap fast forward like one book, and then it's like, we need to burn witches and ban IUDs. Yep. It's like,
how do we get here?
Yeah, it's I'd say the most charitable explanation I could give for calling this spread miraculous is it's very incurious.
Yeah. And so,
let me do this
Colin, do you want to do this next one?
Can there be doubt? If God has spoken, then what he says must be absolutely true.
Citation.
Thus, the teachings of the Catholic faith are not open to doubt, as the Church proclaims, quote, for those who have received the faith under the magisterium of the Church can never have any just cause for changing or doubting that faith, unquote. This does not mean that questions are forbidden. Doubt and difficulty are not the same. St. John Henry Newman explains, quote, 10,000 difficulties do not make one doubt. As I understand the subject, difficulty and doubt are incommensurate, unquote. We may struggle to understand aspects of faith, but true doubt, a willful rejection of the Church's authority, is irrational if the Church is what it claims to be.
So what happens if God chooses, Pastor John to be the voice of God, and then Pastor Jim lies and says Pastor Jim is the voice of God? How do we know who's telling the truth?
Well,
what's the mechanism?
Well, you're describing a situation that happened in church history with anti-popes.
And where you have three popes at the same time.
The conclusion seems to mostly be we all fight with swords until someone wins.
Yeah, so there's the thing where it's like, how do I know? If only you can hear the voice. How do I know you're hearing it?
Yeah.
You fight. Another huge thing in here is the teachings of the Catholic Church are not open to doubt, which, first of all, begs the question that there are teachings of the Catholic Church. Because we don't know what they are, right? You talk to every Catholic and they all disagree on what you have to believe.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it's not apparent what the Church says or how it says it. And this would be so much easier if God could just fax us documents, right? Like every time somebody's like, well, the Church actually meant this different thing, is like God could have just prevented that obvious difficulty from happening. Same thing on the idea of like Christ claiming to be God. He could have just said, I am God, full stop. Instead, it's got to you got to squint through all of this. And then I always hate this. This does not mean that the questions are forbidden. What it actually means is you just have to accept the answers, right? You can ask any question you want. You just have to be okay with.
We will help you understand why you're wrong. We're happy to.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then also
that's what I say.
Doubt and difficulty. You can say like, oh, I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you can't say therefore it doesn't make sense. You just have to be like, that's curious, but I still believe it. You can't ever be like, that's kind of like a wacky belief. I'm not sure if I accept that you. Yeah.
This also sets you up so that you can't. Am I correct if this sets you up so you can't question the document?
Well, you can question as in something doesn't make sense to me or I need the answer to this. But once the answer is provided, that's the answer.
To the audio listeners, I've been eating a lollipop, and I hope it hasn't made it through. But if you have mouth noises, okay, good.
Let's just read this conclusion so we can get through. The Catholic Church is the Church Christ founded. For what has been established, 1, faith requires trusting a messenger. 2, supernatural faith requires trusting God himself. 3, since God has not spoken to all people directly, he must have spoken through a visible authority. 4, the only institution that claims to speak infallibly in his name is the Catholic Church. 5, the Church possesses divine marks that confirm its authenticity. Therefore, if Christ founded a church, and if that church is to endure without error, that it can only be the Catholic Church. As St. Ignatius of Antioch wrote in 110 AD, wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church.
Every time they do one of these quotes, I think of a high school graduation speech.
Fully. To belong to the Catholic Church is to belong to the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church established by Christ himself, the infallible voice of God on earth.
All of these syllogisms, A, don't follow, and B, all of the premises are wrong. But even here, like, the only institution that claims to speak infallibly in his name is the Catholic Church.
Not true.
As if they've never heard of the East.
Or
and
Mormons.
They've never heard... Yeah, or Mormons, or literally any other religion out there.
Yeah.
And even inside of apostolic groups, it's like, are we talking about the Russian Orthodox Church? Are we talking about the Palmarian Church? Are we talking about the Byzantine Church? Like, there are 8 billion institutions that claim to speak infallibly.
I've been to a few church services for a few different, religions, and I've never heard a pastor be like, I think maybe what God wants is this.
Exactly.
Like, it might be the case.
Yeah, exactly.
I haven't heard those caveats.
No, and so
Is this just join us
so
now?
this is our recap.
All right, let's do it.
It reads, at the heart of every great journey is a search for truth. This search, when pursued with sincerity and reason, leads inevitably to Jesus Christ and the church he established. Through the Fundamental 5, we examine the most essential questions regarding faith. 1. Does God exist? Answer, yes. Reason and philosophy confirm a timeless, omnipotent creator. Which is not true. 2. Are the Gospels historically reliable? Yes. The historical record overwhelmingly affirms their authenticity. That's not even a good point to make that's relevant. 3. Did Jesus claim to be God? Yes, through his words, actions, and fulfillment of prophecies. No. 4. Did Jesus establish an infallible church? Yeah. No, to the earlier point, they never even established infallibility. They're just like, the church happened. It says, yes, he built a visible church upon Peter, promising that it would endure. 5. Is that church the Catholic Church? Yes, the Catholic Church alone possesses the marks of divine authority, continuity, and infallibility. The choice before you. Are you listening, Greg?
Yeah.
Truth demands a response.
Okay.
If the Catholic Church is what it claims to be, the one church founded by Christ, then it is not just an option among many, but the only place where the fullness of truth is found. This is not merely an intellectual conclusion. It is an invitation. Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." To embrace the Catholic Church is to embrace Christ himself, who continues to teach and guide his people through the voice of his church. If you have come this far, then you owe it to yourself to take the next step. 1. Seek more, read, ask questions, and explore the depths of Catholic teaching. 2. Pray, ask God to guide you in your search for truth. 3. Connect, reach out to us or your local Catholic parish to continue this journey. The truth is not an abstract idea. It is a person with a capital P, that's awkward, and that capital P person is calling you home. No one can call Jesus Lord except by the Holy Spirit. We at Think Catholic are praying for you on this journey. If you have any questions, need guidance, or seek further resources, please do not hesitate to reach out. May God bless you, and may he lead you into the fullness of the truth.
This feels like the end of like a timeshare presentation. Where you've come this far.
It's such a sales. It's so
Act
sales,
now.
like used car salesman.
Yeah,
vibe.
yeah. That's. Unfortunately, I gotta say, drum roll, please. Not Catholic. I'm not sold on it. I'm sorry, guys.
I was so certain.
Yeah. That was very interesting. I think that there's this kind of adage where it's like it takes a order of magnitude more effort to like refute BS than to offer it. And I think this is a great example where like I think to literally dissect everything that kind of just struck my ear wrong about this would be like a lifetime of just like writing 50-page essays about like, like 3-sentence, excerpts. I think this was honestly most revealing. Is just sort of what it sort of hints at of like the psychology of the people who wrote it more than anything else. And I just, yeah, that's I'm still a heretic, unfortunately, though. It didn't get me.
Well, you just gotta seek and pray, and then you'll find it.
Exactly.
Okay, I don't know. When a well-formed apologist, and I'll caveat it with that. Like there are a lot of people that get into apologetics and they haven't read everything, and they just kind of regurgitate what they've heard that they can prove every step, and they've never looked into it. But like when I talk to professional apologists that like know these issues and both sides of the arguments, it's like you don't think even one of these steps is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't think a single sentence in the like proving Catholicism thing is wrong. And like you read these things and it's just it blows my mind that somebody thinks they can sit down, walk somebody through this step by step without requiring faith, and then like prove that a particular man in a particular place can forgive you of a particular sin in this supernatural way in the back room of one of a billion Catholic churches, and that nothing else comes close to the reasonableness of this for any other religion.
Yeah. Because that's the
yeah.
ultimate elephant in the room is the other religions. It's like there was only one religion in the world and it was Catholicism. It would be less obvious why the arguments are silly.
Mm-hmm.
Fully.
Because every step there's a different religion that has the same sort of pamphlets, right? You talk to the different Protestant denominations, and then you talk to the LDS, and then you talk to the Jehovah's Witnesses, and then you talk to the Unitarian. Like everybody's got their pamphlet and has people that have spent their entire life's work diving into these arguments. And then you like parentheses all of that. And then you go into the other Abrahamic religions. And inside of each of the other Abraham religions, they have all of these other Russian nesting dolls that all say that they can't be there. And then you like parentheses just the Abrahamic religions. And then you're looking at like Eastern religions. And then you go through all of that and like every single miracle claim for Hinduism. And then like parentheses all of that. And then you have to like then go to paganism and then like go through all these intricacies of like Egyptian gods and goddesses, and then you like parentheses all of that, and then you parentheses all of these, and then you have every other alternative conceivable thing besides a like top-down religion on every philosophical point. Like you have it's to like parentheses so many things that like I hate to say it, but some of these apologists, I'm like, either you're intellectually dishonest or like that it seems to be the only conclusion. You have to parentheses every single thing so deeply to like
it's like a fractal. It's like have you seen one of those GIFs where it's like it just endlessly zooms in and loops? Yeah, it's like you could never get to the bottom of it. Yeah. Ugh.
And this isn't to say that all religions are wrong and that Colin and I are the enlightened people that have done the opposite fallacy, which is Colin and I have all of the answers.
Yeah.
The answers is like a lot of positions can be reasonable, right? Like I don't think somebody grown up in Catholicism is unreasonable in the same way somebody growing up in an atheist household is unreasonable. Like we all come to different conclusions about a lot of different things based off of our upbringings, the arguments that we've seen, our lived realities. Like there's all of these things. And I don't know how you don't look at the idea of like spirituality and religion as all these people who are blind, like feeling different parts of an elephant and then like communicating different things. It's I don't know. It seems to be like the closest thing to the idea of like spirituality is people found a lot of different things that work for them, and they might be different, but it doesn't mean that one of them is perfectly right and one is I never get to the stage with an apologist where you're like, so is this like, can you prove this, or are you just going to rely on faith at the end of the day?
Yeah, and one thing this makes me wonder about, this is just purely like speculative, when you meet someone like, Cade, you and me debated Michael Knowles, right? And he is very deep into this stuff. And he seems to try to backfill in this sort of plausible deniability, like secular, reasonable arguments for what are ultimately these sort of like theocratic desires, right? And like, I imagine that he would agree with these conclusions that like, Catholicism is the one true thing and it's all real, and like very, very confidently and specifically believing Catholicism is the one true infallible voice of God, right? Whereas if you take someone who's more sort of like nominally religious, I think the term you've used is cafeteria Catholic, like,
Mhm.
and they don't have this foundation of like, well, I have studied these flowcharts and I know academically that I'm right. You know, it seems like they would not be as comfortable sort of imposing themselves onto the world in the same way. So it makes me wonder if these sort of apologetics frameworks kind of breed or precipitate fundamentalism and sort of theocratic tendencies.
Yeah. Did you
Yeah.
watch Conclave, Kate?
I have not yet.
Have you seen it, Greg?
What's that?
Conclave. It's a movie that came out last year. It was an Oscar contender. It's essentially a movie about picking a new pope and all the process.
Oh, my husband wanted to watch that.
It's very good.
And I was like, and I like movies with popes where there's exorcisms and demons. And he's like, no, it's just a drama.
No,
and I'm like, no one crawls in the ceiling. Or...
It's really good, but there's this one cardinal gives this like sermon, and the thrust of it, he has this message where he's like, certainty is the enemy of unity. Like he's like, I pray that we have a pope who doubts and who's uncertain about things because it allows for humility and and I just like. I think people who do this kind of pamphlet stuff, who are like, I can prove everything to you and it's the only conclusion and everyone else is insane for not following. I don't even think that they're doing justice to their own religion, because I think they're missing some of the better qualities of religion, like sort of the sitting in uncertainty and being aware of your limitations as like a, you know, like the sort of the idea of like your comparative insignificance when stacked up against the almighty or the mysterious, you know. I think there's a sort of level of hubris involved in these kind of projects that I think honestly speaks to a level of probably personal immaturity on the level of like the people doing it, which I hate to like cast aspersions. I don't think it's like a moral failing necessarily on their part, but I do think it's
a huge blind spot.
Yes.
Where
exactly.
like the young apologist hits this, and like you read this document for the first time and it comes alive, and there's all of like the accompanying books in this like industry and genre. And then you hit it, and then because you're only listening to people that already agree with you, it's not that you know that there's counter arguments when you're getting into this, but you've only ever heard the pro arguments.
Right.
And so you feel justified. But then at a certain point as an apologist, you do encounter that even on one of these positions of, I don't know, there's probably 100 different assumptions that were baked into these 27 pages.
Yeah.
And like just on one of them would take a lifetime to unpack. And to your point, Colin, like the best quality of faith is like this mystical, God is a mystery and I'm going to submit to him and be fallible.
Yep.
And that's way more compelling. And so I think apologists often like they set themselves up to fail because they promise I can prove this to you instead of just, hey man, you're in a really dark spot and we have this great community that has some like values that we'd love to like share with you. Come with me to church. I find it a way more compelling thing than somebody sitting down and like, let me walk you through my math problem.
Here's why you don't need faith. It's not let me justify my faith, because I've heard again, like kind of like nominally, like casually religious people, like I don't know if casually is the right word. I think you guys probably have the vocabulary to describe
non-dogmatically.
Where they're like, well, that's why it's called faith. Yeah. Right? Because I don't know for sure. And that's why it's called faith. Like there's something kind of moving and charming and admirable about that to me. And to Colin's point about it being sort of a personality problem, speaking vaguely for the second time in this podcast, just I don't know who's going to see this, but there's someone I currently spend time with sometimes, sort of incidentally, where I'm not like opting to, and they are a lefty, like progressive atheist type, and I've had to stop bringing up certain things around them because they'll just go on these rants. Well, they'll talk about how like everyone who voted for Trump is a racist and all these religious people are like the R word and this and that and this and that. And it's just like this, to use your word, this hubris of just like, you're so confident in this and you don't realize that you're kind of being stupid and reductionist. And I do think that is, that's something that I think it's like this multiplication of that tendency and then religious belief, right? I don't even think it's like precipitating from religious belief, because I've met people who have that problem who are not religious.
Absolutely.
And in apologetics, there's this whole industry in every religion of these professors and full-time people that do this. And it's such an academically dishonest field to go into, because you have to come to the same conclusions.
Right.
Right, Greg? Like you doing
like a
science.
lobbyist. You're like a lobbyist.
Yeah, because like you doing research, Greg, on these biological phenomenon, like you could show up to your professor and be like, I just did this study that disproves this thing that you taught in class.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, oh, awesome. Like, let's look at it. And then they would admit that they're wrong. But an apologist is like the most annoying teacher in class.
It's like a defense attorney.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like that, where every single thing, or a defense attorney in court. I always use the speeding ticket analogy, which is like you go to court and the cop's like, we got you on calibrated radar going 15 over, and I visually confirmed it. And then you're like, and how do you know the radar worked? And the cop's like, I calibrate it every day, and every month we bring it into a facility. And then you're like, well, what if it was wrong that day? And you're like, well, yeah. And then you're like, well, I got the, but also I visually confirmed your speed. And then you're like, well, my great uncle did something bad to a cop, and he probably told you through the generations to hate me, to also then disprove the visual thing. And so my solution out of a speeding ticket is, the radar company was conspiring against me, and the cop was conspiring against me. And then you turn to the judge and you're like, and all of this is wrong because I'm right. And to know anything, you have to know that you can't know anything. So you have to have faith in me as a taxpayer.
And
you're kind of like,
Nobel Prize winning physicists would agree that speed is a function of your inertial frame of reference. So maybe like in the frame of reference of, maybe the car is standing still and the earth was just moving backwards at 90 miles an hour.
You never know.
And on the quantum level, things can't touch anything. So I didn't actually accelerate the pedal because the atoms didn't actually touch. So
it was floating above the road. I was in aerospace.
Hume once said, cause and effect are not actually provable, so we can't actually prove that the cause follows.
Right, exactly. Thank you, guys. We're very smart and right.
Yeah, and then you're kind of like, damn, you were just speeding, right? Like and even in a speeding court, like you look at the legal system and there's degrees of certainty that correspond to the required evidence. In medicine, you have the same thing of degrees of certainty when prescribing treatments, and then the degree of evidence that you need of that patient and of the treatment.
Right.
And then you look at like history, and there's degrees of confidence. You read a good history textbook, and they hedge their certainty in different historical facts based off of the evidence. And all of these fields change. All of them evolve. All of them take new evidence seriously and have like this tentative view of truth that always gets better. And then with religion, when you have this dogmatic view of the world, right, that Jesus never had a brother, is like something you have to believe in order to be Catholic, which most Christians disagree with. And actually they'll say we're just as confident that Jesus had a brother, that he existed. And then Catholics have to arrive at the table ruling out the even possibility of it happening.
Right.
And there could be some just absolutely damning book about the life of Jesus's brother that's earlier than the Gospels, that's more reliable than the Gospels, and they'd still have to deny it in order to keep their job. And that's why apologetics it's not a serious academic field, because it can't change without you losing your job, no matter how much evidence you pull out.
Right. 100%. And one thing, an olive branch, if there's any like people who are currently, Catholics watching this, I imagine you mentioned like they're going to comment like you should read these 15 books. You just don't get it. Well, I'm sure they would find it silly if you did that to them for the other religions they don't think are true, right? Like, oh, you haven't read enough books on like Islam, right? It's like, well, no, like I don't need, like, right? Like so anyone listening to this who is in that boat, it's like you already do what we're doing with every other religion.
And so I think religion can be a helpful thing for your life, something that you choose to do, something that's meaningful for you. without you having to say that you are the only person that has any granule of truth to it, and that everybody else is wrong. Right? Like somebody choosing to be religious because it makes their life better is awesome. But then something making your life better and a half-baked PowerPoint doesn't mean you can take away somebody else's rights.
And that's the most important point, is taking away other people's rights. Because, like in terms of reality, you can go. I know tons of people who are religious who are great, and who are not, at least to my knowledge, are not pushing to, through like legal frameworks, impose their beliefs on other people, right? But I do think that there's sort of an unearned confidence provided by this document that I could see kind of priming someone towards wanting to take that seemingly logical next step into these sort of like theocratic impulses.
And I think we're all reasonable people that have looked at these arguments. And Colin and I have spent years on end reading all these books and come to different conclusions. And it feels so intuitively absurd that the God of the universe would expect the average person to do a lifetime more research into these niche topics than I've done already. Like if you were to have a graph of Christians by distribution and number of hours spent studying apologetics,
right.
I'm going to be, and I don't mean this in a braggadocious way, but like at the top, like out of the percentages of Christians ever who've looked at the faith, both Colin and I are going to be like way at the top of the bell curve.
Right.
And we're not certain about these claims. And so it's absurd of God, I think, to look at, let's say, what I've researched and what I am communicating as best I can as my honest thoughts that don't match up. And he's going to send me to hell for billions of years for that is wild for honest inquiry and talking to a ton of religions. Yeah, that's what will separate me. It's once again, and then we get into divine hiddenness. It's like a father who left you when you were a child that you have no memory of, that you only have ever heard tales about, who only communicates in cryptic chemtrails in the sky, like appearing one day and being like, how come you haven't built my life around me? I'm giving you signs. And you're like, not really, man. Like if you wanted a relationship, like you probably should have showed up. Yeah. Right. Like
there's also a correlation is not causation, but polling data shows that if somebody is more educated in a religious context, they're less likely to be a believer. They're more agnostics and atheists tend to have looked at this stuff more and have deeper knowledge of it than believers, which, kind of, again, it's, the proliferation of like iPhones has been correlated with, the number of times Donald Trump has been elected. He wasn't elected by the iPhone, right? Like correlation and causation are not the same thing, but it does make you wonder if the real problem is that people haven't looked into this enough. And I think there's also a really interesting spectrum here in this conversation, this kind of microcosm where like you guys have really looked into it and I haven't. And yet that is not a differentiating factor.
Mm-hmm. And I was explaining to Colin earlier, especially when Catholics have this tendency when you have a question that they'll just like Google podcasts from people that they listen to podcasts to that they haven't watched themselves, but just like lob it over. And so the initial thrust, it's like in a court of law, once again, you have two sides arguing, and the first side goes and they like convince the jury 80% of the way. And then the other side goes and they bring it back down to 40%. And then you like volley, then you're like 40% and then 50%. And then 45%, and then 47%, and then 46%. Like more data doesn't go from like not convincing to very convincing. Right. It's shades of like these arguments asserted something. I feel like we did a decent job of kind of like pushing back. And then the replies just like just get smaller and smaller and move the degrees of certainty more and more about all of these niche issues. And so throwing more books at Greg isn't going to magically overwhelm him where buried in the rebuttal to the rebuttal of a rebuttal of a rebuttal of an argument, nestled all the way down there isn't the defeater. Yeah. It just kind of gets smaller and smaller.
We also don't need to, you're at a point that why would God design it this way?
Right.
To require this. I would say even just, bringing it closer to earth, think that Catholics, you're not going to, just being honest, for me as a casual guy who me and Cade visited me a week ago, and I had asked him over dinner, who walked out of the cave again? Who is it that came back to life? You're not going to get someone like me to read 18 years worth of books on this, right? So if your argument, forget what God intends. If you intend to convert me, it is not real. You can't force me to read, 7 terabytes of this stuff, right? So you guys, you gotta get it together. As if very, very few people. I have very bad ADHD, and I always joke that ADHD is a really good match for autism, because people who have ADHD can point themselves at anything and find it interesting. And then people with autism, they'll find this one really weird, they'll be let's talk about gaskets. And it's okay, that's a generalization, right? But still, I am very unusual in that even, hey, let's spend whatever this has been, 2 or 3 hours on this. Very few people with my position are even going to be willing to look at what we have looked at in the course of these 2 episodes on this topic. Yep. So if your answer is you need to look at it more, not going to happen. Sorry.
Because we've been going for nearly 3.5 hours, including the first episode.
Yeah. And
so Greg, as somebody from the outside, has spent 3.5 hours, which is 3 hours, 29 minutes, and 30 seconds more than your average apologist is going to get with somebody on the street.
Yeah. Yeah,
you might get 30 seconds out of somebody passing by on a good day.
Right. So this is almost advice for you. It isn't even a critique for you guys. This is advice. Mm-hmm. You gotta, it needs to be shorter than the thing we just looked at and really compelling.
Yeah, it's going to be less time and more convincing.
Yeah. So, good luck.
That feels like a good note, I think. To leave this on.
So that's I think it's the perfect note to end on. And if you're somebody watching at home, maybe this is the last note, and you're Catholic and you've built up the apologetics and you've heard some critiques that Colin and I and Greg have put in this, we're not saying you have to leave. We're not saying you have to instantly become a Sam Harris fan. All we're saying is slow your roll and have your religion for yourself that makes your life better.
Right.
There are family members that you're going to try this stuff on. And Greg has been quite amicable to the idea of us trying to convert him for 3.5 hours. But your grandma doesn't need to be bombarded at Thanksgiving, and your friend at school who's transgender doesn't need to be questioned at the lunch table. And you can have your religion and love your religion and also not force it on other people. Mm-hmm. And look at some more of these resources. If you want to dive more into these issues, we recommended Joe Schmid for Majesty of Reason on point 1, does God exist? And then a second person to look at would be Dan McClellan or Bart Ehrman on the Gospels and the reliability of Christ. And then on the last point, it's not to plug myself here, but it's Kevin Non-Tradicath and myself have some of the only ones looking at obscure papal documents without Protestant ideas. So
are you going to link these, by the way, in the episode description? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So people can
there's rabbit holes just on Joe Schmid, has 10 hours of content on every argument for the existence of God. Yeah. As a master's PhD or a master's student at is that Princeton or something? A prestigious university. There's so much out there. I think if you're doubting your faith and maybe you get to this and you're maybe it's time to leave the church, I always like to end on the note it does get better. I remember when I was watching this apologetics crumble around me, I felt like my life was crumbling and I wasn't going to get back on my feet. But even if things are crumbling around you, you're still you. You still have the values and the strengths and the personality that you do with the people around you. Life gets better, even if your assessments of first century interpretations of literary devices were off. You can still have an awesome life without going into niche typologies of 6th century Jewish mystics. Like, you're going to be fine. Life gets better. Yeah.
The same way that I will openly concede and even argue against other atheists when it's like, well, like religious people are, insert negative adjective here. And it's like, well, no, I know tons of religious people who are great, and that's not true. Similarly, if you are somebody who's really into this stuff, you are surrounded by people who are not religious and are like really happy and living great lives and being moral people, and like, your Catholic PowerPoint maybe says it's not possible, but like, just go outside and look around and meet people. And the same way that when I did that, I learned that like the Reddit atheism forums were wrong about all religious people being these like caricatures. You will find out that your Catholic PowerPoints are wrong about needing this to, have meaning and purpose and happiness. And there are plenty of ways to live your life.
100%.
And if you're wanting to have more of these conversations, you can join my Discord for a whole $1 a month. If you're looking to reevaluate some of these arguments or figure out what you want to do with religion, and just join a group of people that are very fascinated by these topics but aren't going to cram religion down your throat. And if you want to support and make these 3.5 hours of content possible, considering this, joining and supporting this work on Patreon. Both I flew out to see Greg for an upcoming very large episode, and also to record podcasts out there, and also to have the time and all of this. So thank you to everyone on Patreon for making all of this possible. And please don't tell us to read more books in the comment sections.
Not gonna happen.
Greg, plug yourself. Plug your stuff.
Oh yeah.
So I am on the internet. I'm not trying to grow a following. Not that there's a problem with trying to grow a following, but if you do want to see my the random things I cast into the ether, my TikTok is Greg from Video 1, just the number 1, and then my YouTube is Greg Does Videos. So if you want to see things I occasionally post, that is where I am.
If you want to talk to me, join Kate's Discord and at me. That's the only way.
Yeah.
Or a carrier pigeon. One of the two.
I will shoot the carrier pigeon down.
A missile defense, Iron Dome around his apartment.
First, we'd have to de-extinct the carrier pigeon,
True,
like they did with dire wolves, but not really.
Yep.
Yeah, and I guess that's the end of today's episode. Go out there and be happy, or some sort of phrase at the end. Be happy, man.
Yeah.